All right. I'm now joined once again by Conrad Hamilton and Matt McManus, who are the co-authors of a recent Jackman piece in defense of Slavoj Žižek. They are also the two main authors, although I had a chapter in it, and Marion Trejo McManus also had a chapter in it, of Myth and Mayhem, Leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, which I just mentioned because you might want to check out the book. But in this case, we've been watching Žižek debating Daniel Hannan, former conservative member of parliament, and Brexit guy, generally, well-spoken, but fanatically right-wing dude. So I want to get right to it, I think, more or less, so we, can wrap it all up without having to get out too late, without having to go to a part 4. Thank you guys for sticking around into the third week of this.
Hey, Tom.
This is my secret strategy for getting, milking as much publicity from this program as possible. Is just interjecting all the time. I want to make sure we don't get further than 8 minutes in this broadcast.
Fair enough. Well, this should be about where we left off.
I think so, yeah.
Full speed today. Things get better because human ingenuity is an extraordinarily powerful force, provided that people are allowed and incentivized to invest and to, if you like, to profit from their own offering of a service to the people around them. And that, it seems to me, is what every Marxist theorist fails to see.
I don't get you, because you know that this is precisely Marx's point. Yes, industrialization is ugly, but it's a necessary point. It's the only path to progress. That's how I read Marx's text on ethics of British colonization in India, which is even now hated text, where he says, yes, horrible things, all that anti-aesthetic, but we have to go through it. I think we shouldn't forget this, that Marx was, as far as possible, from this aesthetic conservatism, if I may put it like this. As to Bolivia, I know Linera, and she told me, that they did try to industrialize the country, and they got the opposition, blah, blah, from this, as you call them, justified aesthetic Marxists or whatever. But what I want to say is that where I'm trying to, although we are obviously opposed to build some bridges, where I agree with you absolutely is this, which I find one of the most disgusting phenomena today. Western aesthetic progressives who project some kind of false authenticity into poor third world countries, and while they, the Western leftist progressives, want to remain in their comfortable lives, they worry so much, like in America, Native Americans, they should live there, they should continue to live there, how do you call it, authentic, holistic, whatever way of life. And I agree with you, I spoke with some Native Americans. They told me they hate more than everything, more than direct racism, this white progressive patronizing approach, remain authentic, and so on and so on. Some of them told me openly, no, thanks. I want to move to a big city to be nicely, consumeristically corrupted there, and so on and so on. You come to our place if you want. And it's, again, always the same story. And this is, for me, the most perfidious mode of racism today.
Well, not only racism, but I think it's important to look at the socialist angle here. One of my favorite stories, staying in that part of the world, was Sting and the rainforest. He was very worried about loss of habitat and loss of hunting grounds of some traditional people in the Amazon. So he bought a big chunk of the Amazon rainforest and handed it over to this tribe, but he handed it over to them communally rather than individually. In other words, he gave the title deeds to the tribe rather than, if you like, privatizing it among the individual members. Can you guess what happened? We can all guess what happened, right? It's what happens every time that the Marxist experiment plays out. Within no time at all, the chiefs were flying around in private planes, having basically enslaved the rest of the tribe to send them down the mines. They were logging and mining on an unprecedented scale, and the money was going to a little elite. And that, it seems to me, in miniature, is why Marx was wrong.
I see your point here, but again, look at what capitalism produced now. You didn't answer my question, and this is not a reproach. I would just really sincerely like to ask you this because, you know, reading some of your stuff, I saw this tendency too Marxist for me of, you know, local democracy, not just alienated representative. And it may be a shock if you consider me a standard Marxist. My ideal is more and more a good alienation. Yes, we can enjoy our local communities, but these communities can only thrive within a well-organized global service, healthcare, education, and so on and so on. Local transparent communities have a limit. And I think that these big companies that I mentioned, the usual stuff, you know, Bill Gates, blah, 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 Bezos, and so on. Do you consider them a threat to freedom or not?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm sorry not to have answered it before. So you're right. I believe very strongly in localism, in the extreme devolution of power to the lowest possible level, the local council rather than the central bureaucracy, for the individual, better yet. How do we reconcile that with the huge tech companies? Well, you're right that they are monopolies, and you're right that they are now flexing extraordinary political power in terms of silencing people they don't like, saying who can be there and so on. But those are monopolies created by legislative privilege, in particular with the big the big tech companies. They, under a bizarre US law, have the unique power to be treated as publishers when it comes to being able to decide what they want to run and what they don't, but as platforms when it comes to being sued for any of the content. Now, that is not a privilege given to anyone else. That was a very good example of lobbying by a group to create a fake monopoly. And the answer, it seems to me, to these monopolies is more competition. Almost every monopoly, certainly the ones that we're talking about here, are created by legislation or by clever lobbying that creates a niche in which they're protected. When I was in the European Parliament, the thing that surprised me more than anything was the number of representatives of big multinationals who would come lobbying for more regulation because they knew that they could afford the compliance costs and a startup or a new rival wouldn't be able to. I had innocently, 25 years ago when I was starting as a conservative, I thought big businesses would be against regulation. Boy, did I get that wrong. They love it. And they love it because it gives them a privileged position. And if we are serious about maximizing freedom and maximizing local control, it has to be through breaking those monopolies by giving everyone else a chance. That's all I'm asking for.
At this point, I think I'm going to jump in because our back and forth section has gone slightly over 15 minutes, and say that we now move to a 20 minutes or so section where I'll put questions from the audience to both of our speakers and they can try and tag on rebuttals and opinions.
Right. So I guess it's a natural break to say a couple things about this. Which, yeah, I really want to go to the point about tech censorship because I think what Slavoj asked there was a very good question, and what Hannan said sounds plausible to a lot of people. I don't think it really makes sense if you think about it very much. But Matt, any thoughts about what we just watched?
Yeah, it actually reminded me a bit of a quote Adam Smith gave in The Wealth of Nations, where he said, "People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices." And that was 250 years ago. And you have a theorist of early capitalism arguing that if capitalists band together, they're going to engage in cronyism, essentially, right? Now, after 250 years, we still have people coming forward saying that it can be different now, right? If we just tinker around the edges, we can get capitalism that is free of this kind of cronyism and the kind of endemic corruption that we've seen for the last 250 years, right? And what shocks me about that is that it really echoes a point that many Marxist-Leninists will make, and I've pointed this out before, where sometimes you'll see people say, we never really tried Stalinism, right? Or we never really tried statist Marxism. So there's still an opportunity out there. And my kind of argument is, no, it's been tried and it's failed, and we shouldn't try it again. And the same thing in that they say in these kind of instances is what I want to say to Hannan here, right? Capitalism and cronyism go together hand in glove. There's no way of extricating the two from one another. And I think it's really telling that in this kind of instance, rather than blaming the market for these kind of behaviors, he lays the blame on politicians by saying that they legislated this scenario into existence.
Yeah, I mean, and of course there is some truth to his premise that there obviously are lots of regulations that help big companies by creating barriers to entry to competitors, like lots of things that create fees and stuff like that. Do play that role. I mean, that's 100% sure which thing happens. I think he's being dishonestly simplistic about it, because there's obviously also tons of deregulation that is that's enthusiastically supported by the largest businesses. It's not really like just saying regulation yes or no kind of misses the point. It's like, what are the regulations? What do they say? Right? Like something to like fees and licensing requirements and stuff like that might make it harder for people to compete with them. The same company might like regulations to make them pay their workers more and abide by certain environmental limitations that make them make less money. They're probably not going to like. But yeah, I absolutely think that's right, Matt. I think that this is always the point that comes up. I mean, whenever I talk to libertarians, that there's always this, okay, capitalism is great, we just need to get rid of the cronyism, right? Like as if that were a possible state of affairs, that we could have capitalism, without cronyism, even though, as you say, there's no precedent for it. And you have to believe that like you're going to have concentrated wealth without having concentrated political influence, like permanently, right? Like, I mean, if you're going to have a kind of stable, non-crony capitalism over the long term, which is just really weird. Anyway, Conrad, thoughts?
It seemed to me in the first part. Well, the first thing I'd just say is that I think in many respects, and maybe I pointed this out, in our last conversation, but in many respects, I think, the point of Marxist capital is to illustrate the way that, capitalism, which appears initially, or is premised ideologically on the idea that, people create sort of value, have this kind of democratized market exchange, in fact, quickly transforms or inceptively is its opposite. Right. In other words, it depends on this sort of domination, right, on the exploitation of labor power, on the centralization of resources, and so forth. And going further into the question of monopoly, right? I think in sort of the classic Marxian account, you look at people like Sweezy, you would say that monopoly is a necessity at a certain point because of essentially the falling rate of profit, right? Because of automation, right, which forces firms to sort of merge together to offset that. I think it's kind of strange in these discussions, and I do find even on the left, sometimes when we talk about monopolization, we talk about it as if it's something that it's a priori bad. I think in fact, in economics, there's the concept of natural monopoly, In many cases, it makes sense to have monopolies. I mean, I don't think anyone wants, for example, because I just watched Space Jam, so it's on my mind. I don't think anyone wants, like 10 different NBAs. I think they want to see like all the good players there together, for example, right? To give, sort of a superficial example. But I think the real issue is the fact that, once something becomes a monopoly, right? If we can indeed deign it to be sort of a socially necessary monopoly, that at that point, I think very simply it should cease to be private, right? Because all you're doing is running on a treadmill and making, generating sort of like an orgy of cash, at that point. And there's no reason because theoretically the idea of private ownership is that, it's congenial to growth, in a certain kind of competitive climate, right? But once something becomes a monopoly, it's simply dormant. Its dominance is sort of dormant, right? So I think at that point you can say, well, no, it should be public, right? And I know, Ben, you've made certain arguments.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, for sure. I mean, this is I think the article you're probably talking about was the one about the power utilities in California, which is like the worst of both worlds because. And you see that like in the behavior of these companies like Pacific Gas and Electric that will like the sort of degree of like arrogance and like indifference to public pressure that you see there is astounding because of course it's private, right? So they can do what they want, but also people can't go anywhere, right? Like sort of just like putting enough solar panels on your own roof that you can just provide all of your own electricity. You're stuck with them. And yeah, I mean, I think going back to Hannan's comments about the tech monopoly specifically, I'm really glad you brought that up because this is something that actually was talking about in one of the clips with Bhaskar and Michael from Monday's show that like the idea that that the problem with the tech companies is that they're monopolies is really strange, right? Because it's like, I mean, like your NBA example, but even more so, like, okay, imagine a version of like the social media companies that, was like trust busted. Like, what is that like? I mean, you could have, this is really, I think, running up to the limits of what that kind of liberal trust busting politics can do conceptually because there actually isn't, like people say this all the time, we should break up the big tech companies, but like really think about what that means.
Yeah.
You could have, Facebook not own Instagram or, Facebook not own Facebook Messenger even, but if it's still on Facebook, right, that's still an awfully concentrated chunk of power over the flow of information. Or like if, YouTube wasn't owned by Google and, whatever. It was like just its own company. It was just YouTube. Well, just YouTube is still a huge chunk of the flow of information and ideas. All it is that you own YouTube, right? Like, which is, obviously an example I'm keenly aware of with this.
Just a small business in a dynamic, competitive environment there.
Yeah, right, exactly. And in theory, I don't think anybody really advocates this, but in theory, like your NBA example, I mean, you can imagine like really breaking them up, which is to say like breaking up not just like the corporate ownership structure of the, which units is part of which corporate ownership structure, but breaking up the units themselves so you could get much smaller businesses. But that would defeat so much the point. I mean, it's not like if you had to remember, it's like, okay, which Facebook am I friends with Conrad on? And is it the same one that I'm friends with Matt on? Right? Like that doesn't really make any sense. So breaking them up, I think, is a non-starter for this tech monopoly stuff. You've really got to, I mean, if you wanted to do something about like the power of these companies over the flow of information, you really have to be willing to consider taking them under public ownership. And which, I think that sort of classical social democratic natural monopoly argument, makes a lot of sense there. And of course, if they were, then then certainly in the United States, they would be legally obliged to to follow certain rules about free speech. That I would also like. And I mean, the idea what Hannan brings out is like pretty much the standard thing that every like kind of half clever conservative says when this issue about tech censorship comes up, right? I mean, Glenn Beck says the same thing. So, you know, which is because there's this obvious tension between the fact that they're conservatives, they're people who think, oh, it's a private company should be able to do whatever the hell they want. Like that's normally what they think about everything. And then, okay, wait a second, but you're mad at, you know, YouTube, or, you know, you're mad at like Twitter because they kicked off Trump maybe or whatever. So which is it, right? I mean, are these private regimes of power a problem or not? And the way they kind of try to square the circle is by saying this thing that Hannan just said about how, well, really the problem is that they have to be forced to choose, right? Are they a platform, right? You know, or are they a publisher, right? Like because right now a lot of the legal protection that Facebook and you know Twitter and YouTube and the rest have is that they have this, you know, this legal status. Essentially, it's like the phone company, right? You can't sue the phone company for something that somebody says in a phone call because it's just a neutral platform. And so what conservatives will often say is, well, see, that's the thing, because they're trying to have it both ways, because they want to have this legal protection of being a neutral platform, but then they're censoring people as if they were a publisher who can have their own points of view, right? Like you're not, you know, it's okay for the New York Times to not let me publish an op-ed there, right? You know, because they're a publisher, they can decide what to publish, and they'll say, oh, they can't have it both ways. So that's how we solve this, right? But the problem is, what does that actually like? If they're actually, I mean, I know they just kind of mean it as a threat, like that the government can hold over these companies' heads that will take away your platform protection. But if they actually took away their protection as neutral platforms, and so they were now legally liable for things said on there, then like censorship at all these companies would increase by like 10 billion fold overnight because they'd be so worried about being sued. So I mean, it really doesn't seem like either on the monopoly issue or on the censorship issue. I mean, like there's just no there's really there's really no, like, this is something that's really hard to like carve out any plausible middle ground between saying that like, yeah, they should just be able to keep doing what they're doing and there's nothing we can do about it, and saying they shouldn't be private anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can I would you mind if I added one more thing before we
go ahead.
pass? Okay. I just wanted to say too, I agree with you, Ben, about that. And I think you explored that topic quite effectively. I just want to add also in his thing about the sting, like buying the Amazon or whatever. I just want to say this is something I think sometimes conservatives get wrong. He was talking there about he said that, you know, some of the tribal leaders sort of dispossessed and enslaved the others. And I feel like, and he said this is what happens whenever communism happens, right? And I think that, you have to be careful about confusing, two things here, because if you look at, what we might characteristically describe as communist states, even like Stalinist Russia or whatever, wealth equality was actually very, very high, right? And the quality of life was raised, to a large degree for most people. What there was not an economic asymmetry, which I do think, Hannan is suggesting, but there was a severe political asymmetry. Right. And in many respects, this is kind of the problem because, I think if you look at the model of sort of like capitalist societies, there are a lot of people who have very little, influence over control over the societies in which they reside. What you normally have is you have a diffusion of power, I think, amongst a kind of elite. Right, rather than your, power concentrated in the hands of like a single Stalin, right? You have a more diversified sort of bourgeois comprised of business owners, so on and so on, right? So I think, that's kind of the question. It's like, if you look at the relatively total wealth equality of a place like the Soviet Union, it was sustained through the centralized management of this apparatus in which power was concentrated in the hands of one person, right? Of course, in capitalism, political power maybe is not quite centralized to the same degree. At the same time, we see that, inequality is greater, right? But in any case, if we're talking about the problems of these societies, we also have to talk about not inequality, because there was a lot of equality, but in addition to political centralization, also the failure to effectively generate wealth in certain respects, right? So I just want to clarify that I think it's a very, I feel like, sort of glib, I think, kind of comment you make there.
Yeah, well, and especially because he's saying this is all bad because Sting sold it to the tribe, or gave it to the tribe instead of gifting it or selling it or something to individual members of the tribe. But that's confusing too, because what does Hannan think like the scenario would have been if it had gone to individual members instead, right? That they would have ended up being more egalitarian. Like that's very strange, right? Like because whether, even if he was like, I guess if Sting, who I did not expect to come up this much, but if Sting had given it, had divided it like, 500 ways or something, however many members there were in the tribe, still, I mean, over the course of time, I mean, that certainly would have
just going to put them all on a row and say, like, what's your favorite Police album? And if you get the wrong answer, you don't get the land.
Sting is a Marxist. Sting, don't turn on the red light.
Yeah. Yeah, put them all in a line, but, don't stand too close, to the next member. But yeah, no, for sure. Like, I don't know. It's a very weird claim. And I think you're right. Like it's kind of a lazy thing because he's like trying to make it sound like whatever happened with this tribe was like Stalinism. And it's like, yeah, that wasn't really the problem with Stalinism. I mean, not to any like enormous scale. I mean, you'd have, I mean, for sure, there were people who, had to share an apartment, with, a small apartment with another family or whatever. And there are people with like nice DACAs, but, certainly compared to the level of inequality that exists in the capitalist world, it's nothing. Mm-hmm. But, political inequality for sure. I mean, even after in the post-Stalin era, when they had much more collective leadership, like it's still, a tiny number of people, like certainly given the scale of the Soviet Union. Economic inefficiency and civil liberties, all of these are good objections to Stalinism, but like, look at all the economic inequality really isn't. And it's especially like a really bizarre one to stress if you're defending the position that Hannan is trying to stress here.
That's actually the worst argument against Stalinism you could possibly make. Like, of all the ones at your disposal, it's the absolute fucking worst.
Yeah. Well, I want to make another point actually about the kind of aestheticization of ruralism and localism that's going on that I think Žižek rightly criticizes. And this is an aspect of his work that I really admire, since I see it as being courageous, but it's not commented on as much as it should be. Because one of the kind of distinctive things that people forget about the history of conservative thought and Marxism is that Marx, of course, was a mature Enlightenment figure, right? He embraced change and productivity. He welcomed the arrival of capitalism while still being critical of it, which is different than what many of its apologists do. And he was fascinated by the kind of technological and scientific innovations that were occurring during his era. Whether you're talking about Darwinism, the Industrial Revolution, you name it, right? It was actually conservatives initially who were capitalism's most fierce critics. And that might seem strange to a contemporary analyst, but the reason is very simple, right? Capitalism was a dynamic form of hierarchicalization where people rose and fell according to the competitive logic of the market, whereas the kind of aristocratic hierarchies that they wanted to defend were much more static, of course, right? And there's all kinds of interesting stuff that you can read about this, even in Victorian era novels, right? The new bourgeois coming in and hanging out with these uppity rich families and not really belonging, even though he's worth like $1 million or whatever it happens to be, right? So many of the people that criticize capitalism most fiercely from this kind of localist, ruralist perspective were conservative figures, people like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, or you can think of T.S. Eliot later on. And I think it's quite remarkable how often left-wing thinkers will gravitate to the same kinds of reactionary arguments that you would see figures like this making. And sometimes, there's reason to be critical of the kind of aesthetic ugliness of capitalism or postmodernity. I've written on that, and I know you guys have too. But I think we have to be very, very careful not to abandon the kind of progressive modernist outlook of welcoming change, and is seeing a transition towards a more technological, better administered society as an improvement rather than some kind of decline from a traditional era before we kind of mucked everything up, because those eras were very bad and they had extraordinary forms of hierarchicalization underpinning them, whether or not you're talking about, aristocratic hierarchicalization, patriarchy, or what have you, and we're better off seeing the back of them.
Yeah. No, I kind of like that. I mean, it's sort of the, because you want to do both, right? Like you want to, and I mean, Marx certainly did both. You want to not be like the people that Hannan and Žižek are both rightly criticizing, who are like, oh, what about this lost, traditional form of life, whatever, which, like, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think that there is I'm not saying there's nothing to that. I think that, I think ultimately the vision of a society we should want is where people have much more choice about how they're going to live. Which I think there's a tricky balance too, because I think sometimes a lot of people on the left don't always admit as much as they should, is that when it comes to like a lot of dimensions of social progress, capitalism is, actually has continuing progressive implications. Like that, sometimes we like to believe, because it makes everything like much simpler and it's much more satisfying view of the world in some ways, that all the things that we don't like go together all the time. But of course they don't. I mean, there is a, there is a sense in which like the imperatives of capital accumulation are actually good for like, certain kinds of social inequality, that if people are being, passed over for positions because of arbitrary prejudice or whatever, then like corporations actually make less money, and that does provide some incentive for changing that. And and conversely, like I think it's not great that there are there are certain ways that like capitalism destroys community bonds that are bad, for sure. That like if people want to be able to like live in one place where they grew up, they should, and be close to their big extended family, and go to the go to the church that their family's always gone to and whatever. They should be able to do that. And it is objectionable that that like oftentimes financial insecurity drives people to having this much more atomized life. Not that there's I think we should want a society where everybody has the economic freedom to engage in real experiments in living, fully funded experiments in living, that as traditional as you want, as non-traditional as you want. But but we do want to do both. We don't want to be like the people that Žižek and Hannan are both criticizing, that say, oh, it's so wonderful, this beautiful, simple, primitive lifestyle that that you're living. You have no material luxuries, but it's so pure. We don't want to be like that, right? We want to acknowledge that it is a good thing, right? That capitalism has created such enormous prosperity. That it actually, for the first time in human history, like creates at least the possibility that everybody could live a good life and have all their material needs met and all that in ways that just was not true under previous forms of social organization. But then also, you don't want to be like Hannan in this debate and just like pretend that like enough more development will have equality as if that's how it ever works out, right? I mean, that the capitalism creates the possibility for a society where everybody has all the material needs met by building up the economic machine, but it's god awful at distributing the fruits of that in any kind of like remotely equal or fair way, and it massively disempowers most people, etc. So I mean, you can get a much better and more plausible critique of capitalism if you acknowledge both of those things. You say that it's not just because you're right. I see that all the time. People on the left who sort of fall back into that nostalgic kind of reactionary anti-capitalism that we should have nothing to do with. I mean, I don't think that really has anything to do with the, with like good progressive anti-capitalism. That we don't like capitalism because I mean, just to put it maybe like a little crudely and schematically, like we. Like we don't like capitalism because we think it hasn't progressed enough from societies that have existed before, not because it's like destroyed something idyllic, that supposedly existed before.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what I often say about the broader discourse around modernity and modernization, right? You can shit on pollution and you can shit on patriarchy, but you can probably take penicillin out from all that, right? And I think you're absolutely right that we need to be careful here, where we can be extremely critical of kinds of hyper-modern capitalism that vindicate things like colonialism, imperialism, or neoconservatism for that matter, right? I got my start in politics by doing exactly that, right? But we can also sit there and say that some traditions deserve to go to the ways of the dinosaurs, right? If you were to come here and say, do I think that there should be a monarchy, for example? I would say that that's a very quaint question, since I can't really see what the monarchy does, quite frankly, and why we invest so much time and energy into it. If people were to just sit there and say to me, do you think we should maintain something like a patriarchal family structure? Right. I'd say no, we should get rid of that as quickly as possible, right? To the extent possible. So I think we could be choosy about these kinds of things.
That's exactly the thing, right? Because it's like I think the critique of capitalism when it comes to like social progress can't be, if it's going to be plausible, pretending that capitalism always and everywhere, even now, right, even right this second, is always and everywhere an impediment to social progress, because it's not. Right, like like the plausible critique has to be that civic freedom critique, that we should be able to collectively have input into how society is structured. That right now it could be that our capitalist overlords in some cases have incentives to change the structure of societies in ways that are good and progressive, and sometimes they have incentives to change the structure of society in ways that are terrible, right? But the point is just that like it shouldn't be up to them.
No, absolutely. And this is one of the things that I think people don't really understand about conservatism, because it's often held as a defense of traditionalism. And then people get surprised when conservatives will elect somebody like Trump, who says, I'm going to come in and just smash the system, right? It's not a defense of traditionalism. It's a defense of traditional hierarchies against forms of social pressure, including the exercise of social freedom, that want to reform or eliminate those kinds of hierarchies, right? So in some senses, I think the left can be traditionalist if we're going to argue that certain kinds of marginalized ways of life should be protected from domination by power or capital, or whatever it happens to be, right? But we should never lose sight, though, that ultimately we need committed to a modernist project that emphasizes the importance of freedom and equality for all, right? And all the progress that goes along with that. And I think that you're precisely right to say that in such a world, there will be many kinds of traditions that are maintained, but it's important that people should be free to join or exit those traditions or remake them as they see fit, rather than what exists right now, which is where many forms of traditionalism are imposed upon people, whether they like them or not, right? Because they're associated with those kind of hierarchies and power structures.
I would add also, just with respect to what you're saying, just as a footnote, I mean, I think this kind of attitude that, there isn't really a precedent in history for the kind of society that we're trying to create, that we have to sort of break through and achieve control of the productive forces that have been developed. We could say that's largely a constant throughout Marx and Engels' work, though there is, of course, a bit of a difference toward the end because of their engagement with Morgan, right? With Lewis Henry. No, well, that's maybe related, but Lewis Henry Morgan, like the American anthropologist, right?
Oh yeah.
And his writings on indigenous societies in North America, because like the thing is, like in the early writings, at the time when they started writing, the earliest kind of developed accounts of history were coming, were almost like biblical accounts, right?
Thank you, Joshua. I really appreciate that.
So they were almost like biblical accounts, right? So it was very, very easy for conservatives, for example, or opponents of egalitarianism to say, well, this is the way history has always been, right? So the strategic importance of Morgan's work, right, talking about the fact that there isn't gender inequality in these societies, that, you know, in these kind of societies, there's a much greater degree of equality and so on. The strategic importance of that was not to call for a return to that, right? But to make the point that, you know, the very existence of societies in which, you know, many of these sort of prejudices characteristic of our time didn't exist, attests to the fact that we can create a society that, even if it, you know, is far denser, right, in terms of, you know, productive capacity and so forth, still abolishes these forms of discrimination, right?
No, I think that's good. I think that sounds right. I mean, I think sometimes Marx and Engels will, yeah, right. Because if you're using phrases like primitive communism and stuff, there's a different way to read that. But I think I like the way you're reading it for sure. And I mean, it is a little tricky because I do think that sometimes on the radical left we overuse arguments with that same structure in ways that aren't always well thought out, right? You know, you know, say, you know, we could have a society without police because police haven't always existed. It's like, yeah, okay, but look at what existed in societies, you know, in societies where there was no like separate professionalized police force. You know, you'd have like an aristocrat with like some guys who worked for him who could use force with very few impediments. That's a little, you know, I've always thought it was a little bit like saying, you know, hey, you know, sewage treatment hasn't always existed. Okay, it hasn't, right? But the open question is whether it would be better, you know, if it didn't, you know. But I still think I still like the core of what you're saying, because there's like, you know, wherever we can find it. I mean, I think people who are advocating radical change absolutely do need to look for positive precedents, because I mean, I think it's just a psychological fact about most human beings that they have a very, like, you know, very deep and not necessarily irrational fear of anything that feels like a flying leap into the unknown. So the more, you know, the more we can say, and which obviously you can't always, because, like, you know, I mean, the thing about progress is that often it hasn't happened yet, you know, but when you can, right, say, no, here's a thing that we want, and here's where it's existed, and it actually seemed to be pretty good, you know, when it existed, then we should absolutely, you know, seize onto that wherever we possibly can.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Just let me go quick, Conrad, because this is the last point. Yeah. What I really liked Bernie Sanders' campaign for was precisely that it was able to make the case compellingly that progress was progress, right? There are some leftists I know who tend to emphasize a rhetoric of radicalness and change for its own sake, because it seems exciting, not boring, stimulating, and you see all kinds of terminology thrown around that kind of fetishizes change. Now, I like change as much as the next person, and I like innovation even more, right? But I think for a lot of people, change for its own sake can seem really scary, right? And what Sanders did very respectfully, and what I think AOC does very successfully right now, is demonstrate how it is that change is going to make a positive boon, or going to have a positive boon in your life, right? Which is something that progressives aren't always as good at doing as we should be, right? Because they would be able to say things like, look, are you fed up with the way your healthcare system is running right now? Good, you should be. And this is how we're going to change it. And this is how it's going to make a material difference in your life, right? Are you fed up with the fact that you can't put your kids through school without them accumulating a great deal of debt? Good, then we should relieve all that, right? And I think that we need to see a lot more of that on the political left right now. Not just fetishizing change for its own sake, but demonstrating materially how that's going to make a difference for ordinary people who might be reticent to see big changes come because they don't know what that's going to hold in store for them.
Yeah, and especially because, I mean, anytime you're advocating radical progress, you're always at a kind of rhetorical disadvantage because, you know, like, the more unprecedented it sounds, right, the scarier it sounds. And whereas, like, what exists, I mean, you know, people tend, like, you know, if something has existed as long as anybody can remember, then, like, it tends to be just reinterpreted as, like, part of the natural fabric of the universe.
Well, I don't know about that. Keith Richards remembered, so we can just ask him, right? He's been around forever and will be here forever, so.
Yeah, but he's rich now, so, you know, he's not going to tell you. Yeah, no,
Could I just? Oh, quick, sorry.
No, I was going to say, like, you know, I think, like, so I think there are a lot of things that, you know, I think this existed. I think this is true in general, right? Like in any society, that it's, you know, I remember, God, whenever it was, like a couple months ago, I debated Gene Epstein in Florida, and he kept making this sort of rhetorical flourish, like, oh, if Ben is right about how bad capitalist workplaces are, there should be all this anger out there. So why don't people do this or that or the other thing? And it's like, no, right? Like, people only get mad about things if they see them as changeable, or they see them as like contingent things that are one way but could be another way. And I think most people in most societies, most of the time, don't see the like fundamental structures like that, right? So like, yeah, if you can't pay your bills and you're worried about getting evicted, you obviously think that you have tremendous frustration at a personal level, but you don't experience that as frustration towards like landlordism as an institution, because we don't think of that as a changeable thing. You know, that like, I'm pretty sure that like if you're in ancient Rome, even if you're like, I don't know, trying to buy your way out of slavery or whatever, right? You know, like probably most people in that situation, you know, think, yeah, no, my life is bad because I'm a slave right now and I'm trying to change that. But they don't think of slavery as something that's changeable. So like, it just never even occurs to you to get mad about the institution of slavery. I'm sorry, you were going to say, Conrad?
Oh, I just wanted to say quickly, just doubling back a little bit, and I just want to say about the point about the engagement with Morgan and kind of forging societies and things like this, is that I think that at bottom, actually, the account given by Marx or Engels, as it were, via Morgan, is a fairly simple one, in the sense that the argument is that basically, if you look at the diffusion of an institution like slavery, I mean, there's no point doing that, if you don't have a sufficient level of productivity that someone's actually going to be able to create things for you, right? In other words, if people can't create more than they need personally to live, right? So in these communities, you have very, very scant resources. It would be impossible to do something like hire an army in order to like seize power forcibly. So there's a relative, sort of democratic structure that prevails. And actually, that's interesting too, getting to your point about policing. And I realize probably your comment wasn't intended to address like, pre-agrarian societies. But of course, a lot of these societies, of course, they didn't, because of the lack of productivity, there wasn't really property. There was nothing for police to really protect in that way. So they did have sort of like quasi-judicial mechanisms, in the sense that, if someone murdered another person, there'd be a process of mediation, between different tribes. There'd be the possibility of expulsion of an individual from that group, but there was nothing like a professionalized police force. So I think it's also an example, like with the professionalized police force, I agree with you today. If you were just to take away a professional police force and anything resembling our current material climate, well, that maybe isn't going to work, right? But it does nevertheless show that if the conditions were radically different, which I do believe they could be in time, that maybe something like that wouldn't be necessary, right?
Yeah, I mean, right now it would be private cops for rich people and bad Macs for everybody else. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that like my sense is that like the most thoughtful people who use abolitionist language about that, when you really press them, they think like what they really think is that you probably would need some sort of professionalized body to enforce whatever sort of laws that you have, even with different material conditions, but it would just be like so different from what we have now that it just wouldn't even deserve the same name, that it would, like whatever sort of institution would exist at that point, would just be something that was so radically altered that that it'd be like misleading to even call it police or whatever. And there's a whole and I can kind of go along with that, although I also wonder about the utility of using language that most people who hear it most of the time are going to misinterpret. But anyway, side diversion. Let's watch some of these questions.
At the end of their answers, I'm going to
obviously,
Wait, is it not?
this
Oh, okay, there we
country
go.
has made a decision that it wants to have the current healthcare system, and is therefore just not really a political issue. But do I think it's the best possible system? Do I think that?
Oh, I should be clear. Before we had the video, everybody could still hear the audio, right?
Yeah, I can hear the audio. By the way, I might have to take 2 seconds to run inside at some point because it might start raining here. I'm just my arms out checking. So.
All right, but you could hear the audio before.
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
No other system in the world matches it. No, I don't. My personal preference would be for a system of individual healthcare accounts of the kind that they have in Singapore, something that keeps prices down and that delivers measurably better outcomes. Longevity there is better, survival rates are better. You're certainly much better off if you are on a low income there than you are here. So I don't think our system is perfect. I don't think the American one's particularly good either. I think there are much better alternatives out there in the world. But look, I was in politics long enough, and in journalism before that, long enough to understand when an argument has passed the point of correction. And we are now wedded in this country to no fundamental change to our system. There's really no point in debating it.
Thank you. Slavo, a question that's come in from Dean.
Can I just say something? Jeremy Gilbert told me. So Jeremy Gilbert, British philosopher and theorist, really smart guy, by the way. We have a podcast with him coming out soon for plastic pills, but he told me that there's a kind of irony whenever you hear Tories talk about the NHS and healthcare in that country, because the most beloved institution in the United Kingdom, bar none, is the most socialist institution in the country. It's quite something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Goes actually well beyond what we spend all of our time, struggling for and dreaming about, in the United States, which is just, Medicare for all, in other words, nationalizing the health insurance industry. Which is actually less radically socialist than just taking the entire healthcare sector entirely out of the market by nationalizing the hospitals, which is what happened under the Attlee government in the UK. And they've chipped away at that a little bit, foundation hospitals and stuff, but still exists still exists in broad strokes. I guess in a perverse kind of way, I admire Hannan for actually admitting that if he were that if the politics of it were different in the UK and this wouldn't be wildly unpopular, he actually would want to get rid of the NHS, because I don't think a lot of British conservatives would say that part out loud.
Well, you just do the Reagan playbook, right? You defund it, then you criticize it for not doing its job properly. So you defund it some more, and then it continues to spin out of control, and then eventually you just kill it, right? You play the long game.
You kind of admire the old 19th century conservatives too, when you look at the arguments made by conservatives against, public health care, because it's if you look at healthcare in Canada, we pay half as much, per user as the United States, right? Which is, mostly public, though optometry and some other things are not, dentistry. If you look at, the conservative critique of, Ricardo and Smith of landlords, right, it was essentially that, this isn't serving a sort of legitimate market function, right? These people are basically just living off, markups, which are dependent on, increases in the efficiency of production, for example, right? So, you think in that context, you can imagine a similar argument, against healthcare. It's if we have to pay twice as much for healthcare per person, that's not ultimately efficient for the economy, for businesses, and so forth, right? But you don't see that forthcoming, right? There usually just tends to be an extremely cynical defense of private interest, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I should say I've lost the chat now, but someone, maybe I can still find this. Okay. So anyway, someone somewhere earlier in the chat, after the thing about Matt's critique of conservatism, recommended the Know Your Enemy podcast, which I would definitely second. That's Matthew Sitman and Sam Adler-Bell, who do really rigorous deep dives into historical and contemporary conservative figures, and which yeah, I mean, I don't. Yeah, I mean, there are certain things, maybe contemporary issues. Sometimes I don't totally agree with those guys on, but it's a really good podcast, and it's kind of remarkable when you think about it, like how funny it is that like there's nothing close to a right wing version of it, right? I mean, like there's no Know Your Enemy podcast done by right wingers who like really dig into like exactly what I don't know, like Stalinists and Trotskyists were arguing about or whatever on the left. Like it's like there's nobody, there's really nobody on the right who just has anything close to apparently that level of intellectual curiosity about their enemies.
No, they just complain about like the two guys they can actually read. It's like Marcuse or whatever. Like,
right. Yeah. I was just about to say I can always tell what the right wing sphere is hating on any moment because all its major pundits start talking about exactly the same person. For a little while it was Marcuse and everyone was talking about that essay. Then it transitioned to being about CRT, and soon enough they'll move on to the next fixation. Right? It would just be really refreshing once upon a time if they actually bothered to either pick someone who's a little bit more unique than what the rest of them are doing, or if they actually bother to read them. That'd be nice as well, right? I'd really like them to actually go through the repressive toleration essay or something, line for line, explain what's wrong for it.
It's a fascinating meta discourse because they all just sort of copy each other, right? Like, and there's actually zero engagement with like even like Marcuse or something relatively easy to read. There's zero engagement with primary text.
Yeah, no, that's right. Like, not that he's a conservative, but like Matt Taibbi was like the closest, and that's still like a sort of journalistic, very like, it's like entertainingly written, and he clearly read the essay, but it's not like he's going to do a philosophical deep dive on what what Marcuse actually thinks. And
Roger Scruton did, I should say.
What's that?
Roger Scruton did, actually. I mean, a lot of his critiques are bad, but I will give him this. In the Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands book, he does actually read the primary text, goes through and explains what he thinks is wrong with them. A lot of misinterpretation and stuff, but I'll give him credit for that.
Yeah, no, that is good. That is rare. But yeah, you don't have. But yeah, right. I mean, everybody's obsessed with critical race theory this week, but like I don't see a lot of people like, really like going through, Kimberly Crenshaw line by line, and being like, this is exactly what's wrong with, with what she's saying. It's just kind of like, this is what I heard everybody else, was saying about critical race theory, which I mean, whatever. It's like in some ways it's a really basic point, but I also thought it was really funny. A while back, I tweeted out the hilarious thing about the culture war about CRT is that 99.9% of everybody with a strong opinion, pro or con, has no idea what it means, and it was kind of funny because it was like 10% of the people getting mad at that tweet actually read it closely enough to get to both sides as an that. The other 90%, just read it as an unqualified defense of CRT and got mad about that.
Yeah, that's very funny.
All right.
Marxism is, let me put it in this way, it has, my God, I use this old-fashioned term, inherent contradictions. And as a Hegelian, I can easily analyze this. Hegel was fascinated by how a project of radical freedom can turn into its opposite. So if by inherently you mean that it didn't happen because this is one of the favorite Marxist stories, because the revolution took place in the wrong place, in the barbaric Russia, blame the Russian tradition. No, I don't believe this. In this elementary sense that Marxism itself has some potentials for what happens, it is inherent. You know what you should notice? When you read Marx saying very general apparent things about communist society and so on, he abstracts the social dimension. He says in communism, it will be allow collective Robinson. One universal reason will dominate in a totally transparent way the social process of reproduction and so on and so on. So yes, although in some sense, I hope I explained how, I remain a communist, although incidentally, I did my dissident duty. I was for 5 years unemployed in the 70s, never allowed to be a philosopher here. But yes, unfortunately, the answer is yes, in the sense that Marxism, as it was imagined by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and so on, and may I finish with a joke? It's a nice thing. I read a wonderful caricature of development. Marx, big beard like this. Engels, the beard grows more straight, not here. Lenin, a small beard and mustache. Stalin, only the mustache. Mao, nothing. That is nice progress. What I'm saying is that, yes, unfortunately, I cannot play the game that at some point things.
Yeah, there you go, Ben. You're going to have to be our theoretical leader from now on, since you're the most bearded of us all.
Unfortunately, it was incorrect.
Then I guess Conrad comes next, and I'm very at the bottom of the totem pole.
Does capitalism necessarily involve the domination of the global south?
Au contraire, it is the only system that isn't based on domination. Every other system that we've ever lived under since we first discovered agriculture 10,000 years ago has been based on a group at the top who can dominate by force of law. And the way you get on, the way you succeed, is by sucking up to the right people, kings or commissars or high priests or whatever. Capitalism uniquely allows you to succeed by offering a service to people around you, by offering a service, indeed, to the masses, to ordinary people. The way in which some of the billionaires we were just talking about got rich was by enriching the lives of everyone who they sold things to, right? So if I buy something from Bill Gates, I fractionally add to his enrichment, but he immensely improves my life as well. And that is the unique quality of the market system. The economist Joseph Schumpeter put it like this. He said, the achievement of capitalism is not to provide more silk stockings for princesses. Right? Princesses could always afford this. It was to bring the silk stockings in reach of the shop girl. And that's, we've been very bad at making this argument, because there are all these people, I'm guessing, perhaps it was behind that question, who think that somehow when you oppose the market system and oppose the trade deals and so on, you're standing up for the poor. I promise you, you're doing the opposite. Nobody wants distortions, protectionism, tariffs and subsidies more than the powerful vested interests. Nobody gains more from their removal than the people on lowest income.
Can I just make one short point? I like what you, Daniel, said. I tend to agree. When you mentioned domination originates in agriculture settlements, and I think this is another thing where the scheme, our scheme, not only Marx of history, has to be corrected. I think that oppression of women and domination relate not with class societies, but begin already in Neolithic. For me, Neolithic is the big cut in the history of humanity. But nonetheless, we don't have time to go into it now. I nonetheless would insist on this, let's say, antagonist nature of capitalism. Yes, it makes everybody richer and so on, but I cannot argue it now. I doubt that you can dismiss these mega companies, their success, just to lobbying and so on and so on. No, the paradox is that we today live in a time where market itself, to survive, has to be protected by the state. Left to itself, without state regulation, market would almost, I'm tempted to say, self-abolish itself. You may not agree, but that's my view.
Daniel, can we put that question to you? Is a statist approach needed to sustain global capitalism?
So I think almost every classical economist would accept the concept of an externality, which means a cost that you impose on other people, right? If as a chemical company is is cheaper for you to dump your waste in the river, then that is a non-monetized cost that you are inflicting on everybody else. I don't think you'd find any serious economist or any serious politician who says that that should just be allowed to happen on grounds of property rights. There has to be a mechanism to constrain the polluter or the person who otherwise wants to inflict an externality on other people. But the way in which wealth spreads and the way in which opportunity spreads is by removing barriers, not by adding additional ones. The barriers almost invariably end up creating a little privileged caste of people who have learned how to arrange their affairs around that legislation, have made a living out of the legislation, become a constituency wanting more and more state involvement so that they don't have to compete with other people, with startups, with entrepreneurs, with people who can challenge them. And that, I'm afraid, is bad news for everybody. It's bad news for the consumer, and it's particularly bad news for people on low incomes.
I'm going to return to the question of the environment because we've had some of our viewers submit questions on that. I think we touched on what Marx thought of the environment, but a question that's come in is, how will Marxism solve the climate crisis? So I'm going to put that to Slava, and then I'm going to ask Daniel, why won't Marxism solve the climate crisis?
Who is the first one?
You can go first.
I think that, yes, there was in Marx, we all probably agree, this tendency towards reducing nature to just infinitely exploitable background of our productivity. But I think, again, that Marx in the last 10, 15 years was quite obsessed with how industrial development introduces ecological imbalances, what will be the result of this, and so on and so on. I think if Marx were to survive 15, 20 years longer, he would have moved even more in this direction. That was his big obsession. If by how, I know you mean by how, I think it's one big point to be made here, that although we need a state in the sense of some regulatory system and so on and so on, I don't think that the solution is simply let us individual entrepreneurs be egotists, but let the state take care of the general interest, etc. We should never forget that the state can also be corrupted, connected with big wealth, and so on and so on. So I would say that in classical Marxism, there is no clear answer to this, because on the one side, Marx always dreams about abolishing the state and whatever terms he used. You mentioned, Daniel, Paris Commune. But you know that Marx was surprised by Paris Commune, no? Although he did a masterful stroke of appropriating it. But Marx's model was nonetheless state nationalization and so on and so on and so on. And if there is a lesson, it's that this doesn't work. So how to establish, I don't like the term control, social coordination and so on and so on. It's definitely not just through state control and so on. That's basically the Chinese way. Let capitalists be capitalist, let Communist Party, the state, but it's really a Communist Party as the representative of the general interest, take care of, and so on and so on. But we see in China how they are walking on the edge of the precipice. We don't read a lot, but does any of you know how did it go, the gigantic artificial Three Gorges, whatever, with lake? I heard they have many problems and so on. You know, the moment you have a centralized strong power, they are prone to very risky things which can lead to catastrophic ecological results, especially when, as in China, you don't get a proper feedback. Like it's prohibited there to talk about the problems caused by those gigantic dams and so on.
Daniel?
Yes, thank you. I mean,
I actually just wanted to say something in response
typically
to
honest in that and typically forthright in that answer. And
yeah, I just want to say because Hannan's last little diatribe reminded me of a good quote by the Canadian political philosopher C.B. Macpherson, who I'm doing everything in my power to make better known to the general public. So I had a piece about him recently in Jacobin. But Macpherson wrote a fantastic book called The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, which I strongly recommend everyone read. His text on Burke is also excellent. But he talks precisely about how it is that there's a weird disjunction between the ideology put forward by defenders of capitalism and what's actually required to have the kind of world that they want. Because defenders of capitalist markets will almost invariably describe them as free of domination, have an anti-state kind of interpretation of what it is that they're trying to achieve. But of course, even something as basic as protection of property rights, in particular private property rights, requires a vast institutional apparatus in order to uphold. And the more expansive the conception of property rights that you want to take, and by the time we get to the neoliberal era, we know that property rights are extraordinarily expansive and cross nations. The more expansive and institutional and administrative network you're going to need. So in fact, by the time we get to the neoliberal era, the state isn't even sufficient to protect capitalism anymore. We need international law, international trade laws, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, in order to try to uphold and enforce this division coercively, right? And one of the reasons why I think we've seen this kind of populist uprising recently is for 40 years, people were essentially told that their own democracy wasn't able to take any steps in order to try to rectify the kind of imbalances and uncertainties that emerge in hyper-individualistic neoliberal markets. And when people are consistently told that their own democracy can't do that, do anything to fix the problems that they find in their life, then they're going to get angry, right? And the result of that has been a lot of these different populist movements that have emerged, many of which have an extraordinarily reactionary bent, and I strongly dislike them. You know, I've written about postmodern conservatism and all that stuff. But the one small truth that I think you can find in the doctrines of people like Trump or somebody like Viktor Orban is this notion that the state has been heavily embedded in institutional apparatuses and isn't responsive to the needs of the actual people. And so it's not surprising, therefore, that there would be this yearning to take back control of at least the nation state level in order to implement certain social changes. Unfortunately, I think the kind of choice of social changes that a lot of these movements wanted was entirely wrong. Right?
Cool. Yeah, I've not read that article, but I will definitely check it out. And I certainly like the point about state coercion. Like there's a, I mean, the core of this is the Matt, like the Matt Brunig argument, that like there's a sense in which talking about coercion and arguments about redistribution is a red herring, because it takes like all property arrangements are coercively enforced, or else you don't have like any distribution of property, right? This whether you're enforcing an existing one or a new one, right? That's is coercive, but also there is a clear sense in which like concentrating property requires, certainly at least in some contexts, way more coercion than not doing that, to enforce. I mean, a very small example I was thinking about today, because of an article that I'm working on for Jacobin, is beaches, right? Like, it's
actually a big deal in Mexico, where I lived for a couple of years, because all beaches there are public, and a lot of the hotels are doing absolutely everything they can to try to change that, since they think there's big money to be made in privatizing the sand.
Yeah, well, in most states of the United States, it's sort of the case, but not really. Like, beaches, like where I am, for example, right now in Michigan, and I think in most states, beaches are technically public up until the median high water line. which means that if you can find a way to make it there, you can walk along the sort of wet strip of sand immediately along the edge of the lake or the ocean, and you're good. But if you wanted to, like, say, set up a towel on dry sand, so you could, I don't know, take your shirt and shoes off and go swimming, you're most likely trespassing on private property at that point, and
that's where stand your ground rights kick in, right?
if you're Jesus and you can walk on water, it's a great arrangement, I gotta say.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, yeah, it's public, but good luck having access to it, as a member of the public. I was talking to my little brother today, and I told him I was doing this article, this Nationalize the Beaches article, and he told me that sounded like a headline that would come from a Ben Burgess article generator. But like, really, right? Let's nationalize the beaches. Like, it's ridiculous that that there's so many places where there's so much water, and most people have so little, have so little access to it. I mean, if there's one form of recreation that everybody, like it would be so trivially easy to let everybody enjoy, it would be going, like just going to like the local lake and going swimming. And the how little access people have to that in so many places is ridiculous. But anyway, I mean, just thinking about that, because it's like, okay, realistically, which one is going to take more coercion to enforce? This is a public beach; anybody can come here, go nuts. Or private property, no trespassing.
Yeah, I mean, McPherson had a brilliant quote in Possessive Individualism, where he says, it is not a question of the more individualism, the less collectivism, collectivism being the kind of shorthand for kind of statist forms of organization. He says, the more thoroughgoing the individualism, the more complete the collectivism, right? So if you really want this extremely expansive, possessive individualist society where property rights have to be rigorously upheld, and at a very, very expansive conception of property rights, many people are going to resent and be angry with that, which means you're inevitably going to need to use a lot of state or other forms of coercion in order to enforce that regime on people. And I think we've seen that, right? If you think about rising prison populations in the United States, all the kind of neoconservative efforts to install friendly regimes around the globe, countless instances of interference in Latin America, including recently, if you think about Bolivia, right? If you're going to have worldwide possessive individualism in capitalist markets, you're going to need extraordinary kinds of coercion in order to enforce that against a population that often doesn't want that.
Yeah, I mean, I think with respect to this, it's like, I think, almost all, Marxists, not even just Marxists, would accept that, at least in a hypothetical sense, there really can be a kind of coincidence between individual and collective rights. I mean, I think where the question actually gets a lot trickier is when it comes to, cases where it would seem that individual rights, sometimes have to be impinged upon, right? In order to create that dispensation. And I think that's where you get these very, very intense debates which generate around this issue, right? Obviously the right, has, as we've seen, like, has no real compunction about trampling on individual rights when it's amenable, when that's amenable to the strengthening of capital, right? But on the left, right, we have good consciences, right? So we're good people. So, we tend to, I think, debate these issues quite extensively. Right?
Fair enough.
It's worth just stressing the point you made that corruption also exists in the state. I mean, I'm amazed at how often I come across the attitude that people are greedy, rapacious, exploitative, but somehow all of that changes the moment they start working for the government, and they can be assumed to be disinterested and altruistic and so on. Trust me, it really isn't the case, right?
I really want to go at least 10 minutes, but I just want to say nobody thinks that. The point, like the point is absolutely not that the public employees, altruistic, blah 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 blah. It's that if the decision makers are public and you have democracy, then you can vote them out of office. We under capitalism, most of the power structure is not up for election, or certainly not if you're not a big shareholder.
Yeah, which is too bad because I would unelect Bezos in a few minutes.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, I think that when Bezos was doing the press conference, he was getting ready to go to space, and he said thank you to every Amazon customer and employee. I mean, that's a I think that the fact that stuff like that just comes out of his mouth is a pretty good indication that he's not living his life, worried that his constituents, will vote him out of office.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you ask most of us, what should we spend $270 billion on? Sending a guy into space for 10 minutes, or providing people with a meaningful living wage, or for that matter, even investing money in the production of more vaccines? Wouldn't be a tough question.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, that phallic rocket did not seem like a staged political photo op, I gotta say. I think there's a serious lack of accountability going on for that decision to be made.
Yeah. And, I mean, I agree it should be down the list of priorities below all the things you just mentioned, but I actually would like a renewed, public space program. But the amazing thing about this shit is that it's not even breaking new technological barriers or whatever. I mean, it's doing stuff that was done by the public sector several decades ago, but it's just essentially joyriding for billionaires.
I went from the private sector to being a politician for 20 years to back to the private sector, and it really didn't change my character one way or the other. Either way around, right? So we must stop projecting these values at governments. But to answer the question, look, climate change is an externality. Climate change is a classic example of a cost that is imposed on other people, is not caused by the people, if you like, engaged in the activity. So how do you solve it? You leave it to the most brilliant, inventive, innovative people to come up with better technology. And we're doing it. I went the other day to look at this extraordinary thing that JCB have done, where they've got a combustion engine that runs on hydrogen, right? The government has said, this is the goal. We now need you, the brilliant people in the private sector, to come up with a way of fulfilling that goal in a way that is affordable and achievable. The only way that we're going to solve this or any other crisis is with increased wealth.
Slavoj, an interesting question that I want to put to you is, who is your favorite capitalist thinker?
Oh my God, this is, you caught me here. I could easily tell you who is my favorite theologist, Gilbert.
Who's your favorite capitalist thinker?
I know. I don't like him, but for example,
I mean, just straight up, I'll say Joseph Schupender.
For Leftist, made an interesting point of this necessity of what he calls self-transcendence, that, market is only our interaction, but we necessarily reify it into as if there is objective market with which we interact. And Marx was a little bit too quick when he tried to reduce this to just alienation we can overcome and so on. No, I believe in any complex social relationship, you have to have this minimum of reification. Society is nothing but our interaction. But nonetheless, each of us has to perceive it as an objective force. But I will not now will come a real shock to everybody. Yes, I have an answer to you. Ayn Rand. I think she is very ambiguous. She should absolutely not be dismissed as some kind of a proto-fascist or whatever thinker. Her most interesting thing is, for me, not those big, my God, Atlas Shrugged is for me like the American version of socialist realism, where you had that big speech, 100 pages at the end. But she wrote a very interesting, her first book in the West, We the Living, the story of a girl who feels oppressed there. And I learned a lot of her in a critical way, but she's interesting.
How about you, Conrad? Who's your favorite pro-capitalist thinker?
My favorite pro-capitalist thinker. I mean, like
Yeah,
that's a hard question.
I mean, wouldn't it be Jordan Peterson?
Well, I did write a book about him. That's what Elon Musk said about Marx, right? He likes capitalism because he even wrote a book about it. So I guess you could say about me, I like Jordan Peterson because I even wrote a book about him, right? Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like, you know, like I actually think it's a hard question to answer about favorite capitalist thinker, because it's like, it seems to me that, you know, sort of the faith, like the notion of what capitalism constitutes, right, what the free market constitutes, is constantly in variance, right? You know, so like on one hand, it's like, well, I could say, you know, maybe Aristotle, he tried to, you know, give a sort of primitive account of value, you know, he had some appreciation of market mechanisms, but it seems like really, really anachronistic. Or like I could say like Hegel, right? It's like, you know, yeah, he believed that markets had some kind of role, they had to be regulated by the state. But it seems to me that this sort of phenom, you know, of these sort of, you know, because even if you go to like Smith, like older liberalism, right, they recognize the need for a certain kind of, you know, state intervention, right? So this phenomenon of people really believe in this, like, you know, as with Ayn Rand, this totally unadulterated vision of the private sector is a fairly recent phenomenon, I would say. So I'm just, you know, I think there's all kinds of questions of like complex historical and intellectual periodization that arise when you ask that kind of question, you know, like.
Yeah.
What about you, Ben?
Yeah, I was thinking about it. I don't know. Maybe this is cheating, but Robert Nozick, I think, because he's certainly a thinker who was extraordinarily pro-capitalist and argued for it. Although, also, I think that like the most interesting things that Nozick wrote weren't defenses of capitalism. Like they.
Yeah, Saul Kripke had a lot of nice things to say about his epistemology. And if Saul Kripke is giving you compliments in that direction, then you got to be fucking doing something right.
Yeah, I mean, or even like sort of like some of the, you know, like the experience machine stuff, you know, like that's all, you know, like that's all interesting. Like Nozick is somebody who can make really interesting arguments. He's just like in anarchy, state, and utopia. You know, he's you know, he's doing. You know, I mean, he's like a really good mob lawyer, right? Like you know, like this is my job. I've got to defend totally unrestricted property rights. How can I do it? It doesn't quite all fit together if you look closely, but you know, it's like he gave it a really good run. And when he's not defending indefensible things, you know, he's talking about these other subjects, you know, this sort of more abstract value theory, like the experience machine critique of utilitarianism or the epistemology stuff he's interested in.
Yeah, actually, I would add Nozick right up there also, probably Hayek as well, right? But one of the reasons I like somebody like Joseph Schumpeter, and I like Nozick for that reason, is to go back to an earlier comment that we made. Both of them actually took left-wing critics of capitalism very seriously, right? And thoroughly went through the work of proponents of various forms of statism or anti-capitalism and tried to argue for why it is that they were wrong, right? I mean, Schumpeter's most famous book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, is nothing if not a kind of 450 or 500 page, not even rebuttal, but critical analyses of Marxist political economy, right, and the predictions it makes. Nozick devotes hundreds of pages to looking at Rawls's theory of justice and trying to show why it goes off the rails, right? And I think that there's a connection between the kind of power of their arguments in those books and the fact that they were actually willing to take people who felt very differently than them seriously enough to actually give their work a good critical analysis. Right?
That makes sense.
I have my answer, by the way. I had to think about it for a second, but my answer is actually Deng Xiaoping is my favorite pro-capitalist thinker.
I was thinking about saying that earlier, just a joke. But what's your real reason?
I think this guy's a total genius, right? Because he's talking about liberalizing the Chinese economy in certain respects, not, you know, unequivocally. But he has this great line, right, where he says like, you know, he said like, I find these people very naive who think that, you know, markets are necessarily capitalist. He's like, feudalist society had markets, you know, like ancient Greek society had markets. Like, you know, how can you say that, you know, markets are necessarily capitalist? Which is true. right? It is true that, and that's part of Marx's point, right, is that the commodity form, unfolds over historical trajectory. So we were talking about this, I think, the other day, because like when people are like, yeah, how can you be a socialist if like you sell a book? Right? And it's like, like capitalism, is the hegemony of these market processes, right? Which pervert themselves also insofar as, labor becomes commodified, but it's not synonymous with the market itself, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, yeah, it'd be a silly objection, even if like I advocated the abolition of book selling, which I really don't. I think my idea of socialism.
You're gonna put yourself out of business, Ben.
My idea of my idea of socialism is very, very, very different from Deng Xiaoping's, but I do agree with him that the existence of markets isn't enough to make a society capitalist, which is a good thing, because if it were, then we could only move beyond capitalism if we had already figured out how to completely eliminate all markets, which would go beyond what they had in the Soviet Union, by the way, and we certainly have not, so like that's, I mean, I guess like. Yeah, I guess we could like wait for the technological singularity, and then we could like change the economic structure of society then. But I'd really rather not wait for that if at all possible.
It's funny you mentioned that also, because I notice a lot of people defending capitalism along several contradictory lines. But one of the most glaring contradictions that I usually see put forward is this argument: A, that we almost all the boons of modernity to capitalism and capitalization, right? Like I mentioned last time we talked, people like Jonah Goldberg will bring out the books with that chart. Well, they'll be like, look at life expectancy increasing by X amount. We can attribute that to capitalism, so capitalism is good, right? Yet at the same time, they try to argue that it's somehow timelessly associated with human nature, or to go to Conrad's point, that something like the market has been eternal. You can't actually hold those two positions simultaneously, right? If it turns out that capitalism does reflect human nature and there have always been markets, then you have to ask yourself, well, then why was it only in the last 200 years that it finally started to benefit us all and we had the graph take off like this? On the other hand, if this is something that's novel and we receive benefits from it, then we have to ask ourselves the question of whether or not it is actually eternal or in keeping with something deep like human nature, right? And that's a kind of circle that they never really have found a way of squaring, because they always want to have it both ways by making both of these kinds of arguments at the same time, while rejecting the kind of novel and contingent circumstances that allowed for the historical emergence of a stick form of political economy that we call capitalism.
Right. Capitalism is eternal, or there isn't even really something called capitalism. There's just like letting people do what they would do naturally and have markets. But also it's this incredibly novel thing that's only existed for 5 minutes, and look at all the amazing benefits in those 5 minutes.
Exactly. Oh, by the way, I sent I'm not sure if you've seen the Tucker Carlson thing yet. Have you?
No, I haven't, but I got your link. We can watch that.
Okay, we should watch that at the end, because believe me, if you want a good laugh to end the weekend on, this is it.
Fair enough. All right, let's plow through the last 22 minutes of the thing itself.
Daniel, can I ask a similar question? Who is your favorite Marxist thinker?
I don't know about Marxist thinker, but if I'm looking at the socialist left more broadly, I think probably my favorite socialist politician would have been Ernie Bevin. My favorite, the foreign minister, the Labour foreign secretary. Yeah. Very brilliant man. Left school at 14. He was a genuine manual worker of the kind that is almost impossible to find in today's Labour Party, and a very good example of what Edmund Burke once called the wisdom of unlettered men. He had an extraordinary shrewdness that surpassed that of people who had impressive degrees. I don't think he'd call himself a Marxist, but I think the most interesting theorist, political theorist, philosophical theorist, coming broadly, I would say, from the left, is Peter Singer. I think a lot of what he's had to say about not just about animal rights, but about expanding circles of reciprocity and morality is fascinating. And of the people who the kind of people you'd have, to speak at the Cambridge Union now, I've always had a soft spot for Ash Sarkar. I think she's incredibly entertaining and very unusual in that she has a really good sense of humor and can direct it at her own side.
A question I'm going to put to both of you, which has come in: why are younger people more likely to be Marxists?
Here, very briefly, I doubt that this is true, because many of younger people who kind of vaguely are associated with Marxism till now, maybe now it's changing, belong to the so-called cultural Marxism, political correctness and all that stuff. And here I'm an orthodox Marxist and I oppose radically that tendency. I think all these politically correct rules and so on are absolutely to be opposed, not because they are too radical and so on, but because they are mostly extremely counterproductive and so on and so on. Let me take the obvious example. Now it's hailed as a big progress in egalitarianism and women's rights, this you know. Only yes means yes. It has to be registered, the will of both, and so on and so on. But as even many leftists say, sorry, that's not how sexuality works. These people behave as if Freud didn't exist. Freud, who knew well that our desire is opaque. You usually don't know what you really want. Sometimes you dream about something, but the most horrible thing you can imagine is for you to really get what you dream about and so on. So again, all this idea of only yes means yes, regulating, you know what's so tragic? There is only one mode of sexual relationship where this holds: sadomasochist contact.
I just want to point out a really good Michael Brooks quote here. I've been watching a lot of the Michael Brooks show for my book on cosmopolitan socialism. A lot of worse ways to spend your time, I should say, right? But he had a very funny quote where he kind of inverted the old Churchillian axiom. People might have heard of it. Churchill allegedly said, if you're not a socialist before you're 30, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative after you're 30, then you have no brain. And Michael's comment was, if you're not a socialist before you're 30, you have no heart. If you're not a Marxist after you're 30, you have no brain. I thought that was really pretty clever.
Nice. All right.
Again, that would be my answer, please.
Daniel, why are I don't know if they...
So Slavoj is definitely right that younger people are, if you like, more intolerant, more into cancel culture, more ready. And I think we're all like this when we're young. We're more volume 10. And the concept of some modulation of, she expressed that badly, but I know what she meant, and or he's apologized, let's move on. It becomes slightly, more awkwardly when you're seeing things in bright primary colors. Frankly, I think we all tend, as we get older, I'm not saying whether it's a good or a bad thing, but we all tend, as we get older, to become more interested in practicality rather than just theory. And that tends to erode all of these utopian ideologies that say that they have an answer to everything.
I want to, before we go to closing statements, I want to just put one final question to each of our wonderful speakers. Slavoj, a question has come in, which is, can you differentiate between Marxism and socialism?
And, sorry?
Can you differentiate between Marxism and socialism?
Well, both notions are so blurred today. What does it really mean to be a Marxist today? For Marx, he at least stuck to that. Marxism didn't mean just some kind of a general theory or theory of ideology. It means putting into theory a real desire for change of actual people who experience suffering and so on and so on. And all the 20th century Marxism was one big explanation why the revolution didn't happen, That's why Marxists, for false reason, like psychoanalysis. They say there should have been a revolution. There wasn't a revolution. Why? Oh, ask psychoanalysts, because we are so manipulated, and so on, and so on, and so on. So I doubt how much actual Marxism there is today among those. As for socialism, this term is even more vague today. Often socialism is reduced to like, yeah, I'm a socialist, which means I care for all people, I want less poverty, and so on and so on. So to answer properly, we would have to go much more in detail into what these terms mean today.
Thank you. And Daniel, has the pandemic shown that libertarian and free market ideologies don't work well in a crisis?
Yes. Also, Marxism Marx wrote about many things, but Marxism in the primary sense is a theory of history and how, capitalism, develops out of feudalism and socialism might develop out of capitalism. Socialism is the name of an economic system. So, that's, for whatever it's worth, is how I would have answered that question.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that the connection to praxis, right, to changing the world is intimately related to this sort of obstetric model, right? Because the idea is that, if you're trying to start, from the present, right, and to, take advantage of the means at your immediate disposal, right, then you have to perceive things as progressing along in a more developmental pathway, right? If you're holding out for a sort of, entirely messianic kind of vision, that's not going to work, right? So, of course, there were people before him, like Fourier, with this kind of infinite periodizations. We all know kind of the punchline, right? The salinated seas of lemonade, and this kind of thing. I'm
still looking forward to that personally.
Well, what's wonderful, what's great about Marx, and I think Lenin really captures this in State and Revolution, is the way that, in a sense, right, if you look at, something which seems very aspirational and futuristic, like the abolition of the value form or something like that, Marx maintains, the possibility of realizing these things, right, but they're displaced in a sense, right, because if we're going to start from the present, if we're going to affect immediate change, then we have to accept that there needs to be a kind of, progressivist or developmental model in a way, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the difference is important. Marxism is a critique of political economy, first and foremost, and capitalist political economy above all else. And I think here, Marx himself is in a tradition of people who launch critiques, critique being understood as analyzing the conditions under which certain forms of understanding emerge. That goes back to Kant. And what Marx analyzes very brilliantly, as Ben said, are the historical conditions through which capitalist political economy can materially emerge, and then how it creates a kind of ideology or way of looking at the world that kind of both supports it and at various times undermines it, right? Whereas socialism is a conception of how it is that the economy and society should be organized, predicated on 1,000,001 different kind of theories, principles, forms of activism, and hopes and dreams and aspirations, right? I actually think it's a lot easier to come up with a consistent label for something like Marxism, because, to some extent it has to be in keeping with the actual thought of Karl Marx, right? Whereas socialism is a much more overdetermined label, and trying to pin it down, I'm not even sure I'd want to, is a much more precarious process.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's useful to reserve socialism for the prospect of a mode of production that would come out after capitalism, something that wouldn't be a reversion to pre-capitalist forms, but would be something better than capitalism, which is vague, but is still like a controversial, definition, not so much theoretically, but in practice, because I think a lot of people, like Slavoj kind of said earlier, like a lot of people, by socialism, just sort of mean, kind of something that's so vague that it doesn't even necessarily mean that. And maybe it's just, I mean, I don't know how much I want to fight about it, as a matter of, because obviously there's a sense in which, we can just use the word to mean lots of different things, and, we can just disambiguate it. And, I mean socialism one, you mean socialism two. But I'd like to kind of insist on that, because I think it's important to convince as many people as possible of that, which is not to say that you should that it's bad that lots of people are, are confused and have half-formed ideas, and maybe like when they use the word socialism, they don't exactly envision anything more than like pretty mild social democracy, but like somehow their use of it also expresses a more basic dissatisfaction with the way things are. And I think that's like even if it's very like incoherent and whatever, it's like usefully so, right? Because that's what it looks like when lots of people's ideas are changing very quickly. You're going to get a lot of people who are a little bit confused about it, and you certainly shouldn't tell them like, oh, you're not a real socialist, right? Like there's I don't know if she still does it, but Liza.
We don't do that on the left, Ben. We would never chide someone for not being puritanical enough about their principles.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know if she still does it, but Liza Featherstone was at one time doing an advice column at The Nation, and somebody wrote in and be like, my friend like thinks they're a socialist, but really they're just like a wishy-washy social democrat. How do I break it to them? And she said, it's socialism is not like your favorite, whatever she said, Norwegian hardcore band that's not cool anymore, because it got too popular. Like you want to encourage people, not discourage them, to move in your direction, to move in your direction politically, which I think is. I think is exactly right. I mean, I think that it's possible to push that more radical idea of what socialism could be, but do it in a way that feels like you're welcoming people and encouraging them to go further, rather than in a way that encourages them to think that like they're just stupid normies, but like you really have the sort of cool advanced politics.
Yeah, which is frustrating because the political right is a lot better at this than we can sometimes be, right? Where they do everything they can to try to moderate themselves, build as big a coalition as they possibly can, and then radicalize afterwards, right? Now, I'm not saying that we should be like the political right, because we shouldn't be, right? But tactically, there is something to this idea of allowing a political label, to be underdetermined so that people can make use of it and apply it to a lot of different contexts, because that's how you build coalitions, right? On the other hand, I do think there's a danger in giving people too much leeway to reinterpret a political label, because, for instance, we don't want National Socialists to be taking the term and using it to advocate for eugenic right-wing causes, right? So I think that there's a kind of balance that we have to achieve. I think that the kind of example you gave is a good example of where we should be very lenient in encouraging people to use the S word. But I think in other instances, it's important for us to be kind of brutal anti-Wittgensteinians and be like, no, there is an essence to words. Whatever it is that the NSDAP wanted to call themselves, they were not socialists, they were fascists, and we have no truck with them.
Yeah, you should have a big tent, but not big enough for Nazis. I agree with that.
And we don't. I just want to add, I don't think we appreciate this enough today. But when you're talking about, sort of the, how supple it can be, right, with the co-optation of language and everything. I think in many ways, Marx's use of the term socialism was actually a kind of co-optation in his time, right? Yeah, because if I understand, like, what Marx was advocating for, and actually there's a passage in his work where he differentiates communism from socialism, right? He says, communism is the sort of the self-driven movement of the workers, right, towards a radical dispensation, which forms of private appropriation are abolished, right? Socialism, is the middle class movement, right? And obviously he would be thinking here of people like Saint-Simon, right, who are imagining from on high, right, the sort of administrative conditions that would have to be required to manage the economy, right? I think in a way when Marx uses the term socialism, he's actually advocating something different than the people that came before him. Right, because industrialization the impact of industrialization hadn't become apparent enough to them that they had sort of treated the proletarian as the kind of universal class, as it were. So he's already entering into that fold and transforming its meaning, right? And I think communism is a word which refers, more specifically, right, to what he was attempting to achieve. But now, of course, he was so successful that it's like the two can almost be applied to some extent synonymously, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, during some phases of his life, he did use them synonymously, although there are other times he makes a distinction. It's and of course Engels famously like differentiates what he advocates from some of those other thinkers by saying, okay, there's utopian socialism and there's scientific socialism. I'm not always sold on how long-term helpful that that last bit of terminology has been, but it's. I mean, I know what he meant by it, but yeah, no, I mean, and again, ultimately, yes. Other than I agree with Matt's exemption for Nazis, but other than that, I mean, I think it's better to not focus on fighting about words and to kind of be able to project like an attitude like, yeah, you're socialist, that's cool, you want universal health care, so do I. I would also like, I also want to socialize, the means of production, but we can work together on the first thing, while we have further dialogue on the second thing.
I think you made this point really well, actually, in your new book, Ben Canceling Comedians, where you pointed out that one of the problems with this puritanical attitude is it really emerges from being a party that continues, it's a part of an ideological or political group that sees itself as continuously being in opposition, right? And when you continuously see yourself in opposition, it can be very easy and very tempting to start to police the moral purity of your members, right? By saying, you're not the real deal, I am, right? I'm the one who really sacrifices and loses for what we should believe in, right? But if you want to be a party or a doctrine that wins, right, you're going to have to accept that people are going to interpret your doctrines in some ways that are very different than you do, right? That's how you build a coalition. That's how you seize political power. And that's how you actually implement constructive change, right?
Yeah. And like lots of people, like, I mean, this is sometimes hard for people like us because, like, I mean, we're like nerdy left intellectuals who spend all of our time thinking about this stuff. Most people don't. And so, like, most people are at any given point going to have, what are objectively pretty confused ideas, combinations of ideas. And, you can work with that or you can do something other than politics, but like, those are your choices. Right. So, I mean, I think kind of along the lines a little bit of that obsestric, I can never pronounce that word, understanding of the emergence of socialism from capitalism and all that stuff. I mean, like sort of by analogy to that, right? I mean, I think that it's much healthier to focus on the direction in which people's ideas are changing rather than like what their level of understanding is at any given moment.
Well, I think if I want to add that, I think, it's of course, like, we shouldn't be unnecessarily making enemies. I do think it's important to remember, though, if we look at, someone like Marx, right, why was he so sort of insistent, right, on his own singular definition of what socialism was, which he was, right? We know about, the battles and the IWA and all this. And, it wasn't, just because he wanted necessarily to prove that he was the most intelligent person in the room, though I don't wish to suggest that he didn't sometimes have that desire. But, it was because he felt it was very important to break with a lot of his, counterparts and to insist upon these things because he saw that, it was his sort of ideas that were creating the possibility of fostering a mass coalition, right? So in a way, he wasn't too concerned about, using the word in a way that, a handful of intellectuals necessarily agreed with him or certain existing left forces agreed with him, right? His goal was to actually radically transform the sort of demographic basis of the left. Right, which obviously he was, that those ideas were terrifically successful in facilitating, right? So I think sometimes too that, there's a weird paradox sometimes where in order to, to build those bridges and to assemble those coalitions, you have to pit yourself against the people who are immediately around you, right? Not just think in terms of who's already there, but who could be there, right? In that.
Well, yeah. So I'd make a distinction between like putting yourself in opposition to, like, people who have alternative, well-formulated ideas and people who, just kind of have a confused mishmash of ideas like most people do most of the time, right? Like, like I think it's sometimes very necessary to put yourself into opposition to, to people who are, to people who have like well-defined alternative ideas, especially if the way those people are is actually an obstacle to reaching some much bigger, much more important, group of people. but also, with ordinary people, or even really with politicians. Like, I think, I think it's just going to be like a weird mishmash most of the time. It doesn't mean you shouldn't criticize them, especially politicians, but it also means that I think for those contexts, I think the most productive mode of criticism isn't comparing them to what the fully worked out version would be, and giving them a failing grade, for not thinking the fully worked out thing, but thinking like, okay, are they moving in the right direction? If not, what can I do to try to encourage them to do so? Speaking of which, El Macho Shrigma, thank you for the super chat, says, obviously on the personal level, if we know a neo-Nazi for some reason, it's worth trying to persuade them. Is it productive on a mass public level? I don't know. Depends what you mean. I think that, for the most part, I'm inclined to say no, just because you should pick your battles. And I think that people who are, somebody who's an actual neo-Nazi, they're probably not, they're probably not like the most productive, way to spend your time is trying to convince them of anything. That said, though, like, there are people who come around from that, and the word that's usually used is de-radicalizing, which I'm not crazy about for obvious reasons, but like I know what it means in this context, and I think there's some value to that. I think there are some people who are good at that, and Godspeed to them. I think like even some like early ContraPoints videos were all about like sort of taking on like actual like fascist like talking points, like in a sort of this very good humored sort of way, being like, okay, guys, this is why it doesn't make any sense to say that the white race is going to, disappearing or whatever. And like I said, it's not something I'd necessarily recommend that most people spend their time on, but I think it's probably good that there's something that's available to people who are in a position to be, de-radicalized and then preferably re-radicalized in a more positive direction. That it's probably good that there's something that's out there that fills that niche, just so if there is somebody who's coming, who's that far gone, who is at a point in their life where for whatever reason they're particularly open to, coming back from the brink, that there's somebody who can like give them that, who can help them along.
Could I just add something that I think one thing we often, when we have these engagements, I see a big mistake, a huge mistake I think the left makes very often, is that we think in terms of, we don't look at the social position enough of who we're engaging with. So we think in terms of, positional proximity in kind of a superficial way, right? Like, oh, these people are liberals, so their views are kind of like ours. So if we just kind of push them a little bit more in that direction, that'll work. And I think the risk of this, is that, if you look at the people who have views that are maybe sort of rad lib or whatever in our society, very often they come from very privileged demographics, and they might be persuaded to accept, some very limited level of government intervention, but I'm very skeptical that these people can be, that you're going to really build socialism out of that, a very privileged coalition. And I think if you look a lot of these people, in, sort of far right, populist right, and it's a bit of a cliche, but I do think you have a lot of people who are frustrated, right? Who are in economically precarious circumstances. I'm not saying that's all of them, of course, but I think insofar as that's the case, in many respects, it can seem more intimidating, or more futile, as it were, to engage in those kind of conversations. But I think the results in terms of political coalition building can actually be more effective. And if I had to say that there's a fault right now with the whole strategy that's being pursued by, sort of DSA, whatever, and I can't generalize too much, but I do think that there's this sort of, even after Sanders, Corbyn, this notion that you can just sort of parachute, some hardened socialist into, a deeply bourgeois context without transforming the demographic basis of support and be successful. I don't think that's going to work. So I think victory cuts through Trump country, and that's something we're going to have to get our heads around before we're really going to, succeed.
I agree with a lot of that, but the one thing I would push back on a little bit is I think it's often overstated the extent to which, that kind of right-wing populist base is working class. Some of it is, right? But like quite a bit of it is not, right? I mean, quite a bit of it is,
I should say there've been a number of studies done, and uniformly, the wealthiest people in the country voted Republican in 2016 and 2020. And most donations by people who had $1 billion or more also went to the Republican Party, right?
Yeah,
which isn't to say that there isn't a working class basis for elements of Trumpism. There is. Right? We got to be cognizant of that.
Yeah, there is.
They're also the most significant in terms of constituencies. Like if you look at swing states, right? It was industrial bases that were, so it's different when you look at the whole country than when you look at which are the actual regions that are causing, the Republican Party and its populist mode to win, right?
Yeah, although I would also say there that, like, the swing state, I mean, like Michigan, for example, I mean, do I think that there are people who voted for Trump in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, who are working class people who would have voted for, just to be concrete about it, Bernie Sanders, right? Yeah, for sure, I do. I think that exists. I think it's a relatively small portion of the Trump electorate because, like Matt says, the overall Trump voting base did tilt higher income than the overall Hillary voting base, which is not surprising since for the most part, it's just the same old, Republican, voting base. But people who were in that category Conrad's talking about were incredibly important for the outcome of that specific election. That wouldn't have taken very many of them to make a difference. But it's also, I guess the other thing I'd say too is that, like, even there, I think the thing that people often miss about the 2016 election is that if you really start to look at those numbers in a very real sense, it's not that Trump won, it's that Hillary lost, right? That there was a drop off from Romney 2012 to Trump 2016. It's just that it wasn't as big as the drop off from Obama 2012 to Hillary, 2016, and there was a big increase in the people who just didn't vote or who had or who voted but who left the top of their ballot for the president blank, right? Which is not necessarily. I mean, I guess what I think is probably the most careful, true thing to say about this is that there are a lot of working class people in cities like Detroit and Flint and Milwaukee who did something in 2016 other than vote for Hillary because they were disgusted. Some of those people, white ones particularly, voted for Trump, although that's a very small percentage of the people who voted for Trump, but some of those people voted for Trump. And probably most of them just didn't vote, right? So I mean, I don't know how much of a difference this distinction makes because I think the ultimate thing is just that you'd win a lot of these people back, whether they're non-voters or Trump voters or whatever third party voters, with a better with a better candidate. But also I do think it is a little bit I think especially the media coverage, the people, the media got really obsessed with this category, the WWC, the white working class, for about a month after the election, before they switched gears to Russia and never came back. And it's not. Oftentimes when you'd read these profiles, there'd be New York journalists who go on these anthropological expeditions to see what the savages were saying in Youngstown, Ohio, and profile Trump voters. If you looked at those things, a lot of people who would be sort of portrayed as exemplars of proletarian content, you actually look closely at the description and be wait a second, this guy owns a used car dealership, right? I mean, he's not a worker. And I think oftentimes, it's like kind of a cultural designation. I mean, none of that means there aren't working class people who voted for Trump who, would have voted for Bernie. I for sure think those people exist, although I think they're probably even
I've met them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think anybody who's been around a little bit has probably met a few, right? But like those people for sure existed. I think there were even more people who just didn't vote who would have been brought around, but I mean, also like most of the also the Republican like electorate in general is like tilts more middle class, if only because of like racial voting patterns. So I don't want to like I also don't want to like overestimate the extent to which that's like who voted for Trump, or like those are who we need to be thinking about. But I
have to look at. Could I just cut in really quick? You have to look also at what segments of the right we're talking about, right? Because like the United States, the Republican Party is such a big tent party that when we talk about the far right, it can be hard to sort of demographically distill who supports it. But I think it's very interesting, right? If we look in France, right, because we see that in France, the parties that have the lowest income voters on average, right, are the far left, right? So Mélenchon, right, but also the far right, like Le Pen, right. And I suspect that if you look at a lot of very, very extreme manifestations, you're finding them in areas where there's a lot of economic discontent, right? So I don't think that, as you said, I think when we talk about the Republican Party as a whole, when we talk about their entire demographic base, I don't think we can overplay, the notion that economic precarity is what causes them to be elected or whatever. But I think when we are talking about right-wing radicalization, or any sort of radicalization, for that matter, it becomes an important subject. And I do think that if you look at more extreme right-wing parties in other countries, in the United Kingdom would be another example that you will find that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is one of the instances where I find people not being careful enough with the distinction between left-wing populism and right-wing populism. And I even know some quite savvy left-wing analysts who missed this with the 2016 election, where they kind of bought into the Republican rhetoric about speaking for the people and assumed this was somehow an emancipatory movement, right? Left-wing populism typically takes the form of demands for inclusion by groups that have never had certain kinds of privileges or entitlements, right? Whereas right-wing populism is about restoring certain kind of privileges to people who feel entitled to them without necessarily granting them to anyone else, or indeed even removing them from people who've been granted to them, because there's this feeling that too many grants of privilege have polluted certain entitlements that a group used to just expect to be their purview and their purview alone, right? And this idea of restoring privileges to a group can be very powerful if you're from a certain kind of marginalized community. Like what Conrad was saying, a lot of the National Front support in France comes from rural areas where people feel that they haven't gotten the kind of shot like people in big cities have. And they associate this with the kind of pro-immigration policies that have been, well, not pro-immigration, comparably pro-migration policies that have been put forward in France for a long time, right? In the United States, I think there was a segment of the white working class that did justifiably feel that it had been ignored for a very long period of time. Did actually see that its wages were declining or remaining constant, did actually see that they had less respect in society than ever before. And these are all legitimate grievances to have. It's just that rather than directing them to the right target, which was neoliberalization, right? I think what Trump was able to do was to say, we're going to insulate the kind of privileges and hierarchies associated with capitalism from criticism, and say that who you really should be angry about are these uppity groups that are coming up demanding things that we never would have given them before and receiving it from democratic governments, right? And that narrative was powerful enough to win him the election, albeit, with less voters than someone like Hillary Clinton, right? But it was in no way an emancipatory or democratic call, right? It was an extremely reactionary one. And in the end, of course, we all know the form it took. It took the form of entrenching the kind of privileges of capital, while at the same time taking away the hard-won privileges of historically marginalized groups in the United States who have fought for centuries in some cases in order to win a vestige of respect from the state and from their fellow citizens.
All right, let's really see if we can get through this last 16 minutes.
On the contrary, but I think it has probably set them.
Is everything okay? Because we can't. The screen's not up. I don't know.
How over vaccine imports should have knocked on the head any idea that each country should just try and do its own thing. We could fill every inch of storage.
Oh, hold on. Was there no sound during that?
I heard things.
I didn't. Oh, just then? Yeah, there was sound just then.
Oh,
yeah.
Just then, but before that.
Not before that, no.
Okay, then we have to go
We
back.
couldn't see the screen, or yeah.
Let's try.
How much actual Marxism there is?
It's the trade matters, right? Buying the stuff you want matters. The row over vaccine imports should have knocked on the head any idea that each country should just try and do its own thing. We could fill every inch of storage in the UK with all of the stuff we think we might need in terms of PPE, vaccination, whatever. And then a different kind of emergency comes, we find we've got all the wrong stuff, right? So the one thing that we should have learned as a result of the coronavirus and the associated lockdowns is that security comes not from trying to produce all of your own stuff, because you're just as vulnerable to a local shock that happens to be in your own country as anywhere else. Rather, security comes from having a diverse variety of suppliers so that you're always able to get some stuff from somewhere. If you like, we should be more Singaporean and less North Korean. Singapore imports everything, right? It's food, it's drinking water, it's electricity, incredibly rich country, very secure. North Korea, Juche.
Very authoritarian also.
Make everything yourself, self-reliance. The last place on the planet where you still have man-made famines. However, this was a difficult argument even before the pandemic. Now, I'm afraid we've been thrown back on our basic caveman heuristics. We think with our Paleolithic minds, never mind Slavoj's Neolithic revolution. We want to avoid strangers because they probably carry pathogens. We want to keep our kids close. We want to hunker down. And when you translate that into policy, unfortunately, it becomes closed schools, closed borders, closed shops. And I'm afraid this will be with us for a long time. I think we're going to be in for a much more authoritarian age in which voters don't just accept, but actually demand the smack of firm governments.
Amazing to listen to all this and then remember that he was a huge Brexit guy.
Right.
So it's going to be a pretty bleak outlook for those of us who believe in individualism.
But you see, may I just add something not polemical even? Yes, I agree with you here. But you see, that's my problem. What you call openness and so on, trading, I call international cooperation, and this shouldn't be reduced only for me to free exchange of goods and so on. We will need this, I agree with you, terrible. What if, imagine, I had a friend, high European bureaucrat, you don't like them, who went to Japan, part of European delegation, immediately after that Fukushima horror. And he told me that for a couple of hours, Japanese government was in a panic. They thought that the entire Tokyo area will have to be evacuated. This will be, for me, the crisis of the future. And this global crisis where cooperation between nations will be needed. Like, for me, first sign of this crisis of the future is what's happening now between Ethiopia and Egypt. No? Both are in some sense right, for the water of Nile. Ethiopia says, sorry guys, we are a sovereign nation state, this is our water. Egypt says, sorry, we survive on that water, and so on and so on. That's one model of the problems of the future for me. And I also, I hope we all agree with this, I also claim that the Chinese strategy, strong centralized government and so on, doesn't work here. So I still insist, we need modes of international cooperation, which nonetheless, I think, will have to reach beyond market, not necessarily against market, but beyond market. Otherwise, with serious catastrophes, we are lost, I think. But I agree with you that this lockdown nationalism and so on, this each for us, this is a mega catastrophe.
Thank you, and thank you for that section. I think it was a whistle-stop tour through various aspects of Marxism. We now move towards closing statements. So, Slavoj, you're going to have 5 minutes to sum up why this House should believe that Marx was right. Your 5 minutes start now.
Oh, you see how mixed I am. I'm not saying Marx is simply right. I'm saying that some elements of Marxist analysis, ideology, and so on are very worthless. Worthless. My God, what a Freudian slip. Worthwhile today. But I'm saying this, that if you want to be truly in the spirit of Marx today, you have to critically, as it were, reinvent it in the sense of, let's see what are the problems today. And today, the big threat I see is definitely not Eurocentrism or whatever. I think that European legacy of emancipation is something we should be proud of and not downplay it in the sense of, yes, but because all the catastrophes in the world, yes, we did. But do people notice that all critics of Eurocentrism refer to notions, procedures which are part of European Enlightenment legacy to criticize Europe itself? So here I remain, to the horror of some of them, Eurocentrics, but my real problem, and you can then do in the final rebuttal, Daniel, to answer this question, don't you worry as a liberal and so on about the economic success of countries like China, India, and so on? Isn't something new emerging there? Let's call it maybe authoritarian capitalism or whatever. What I don't like is this. If there is something that unites the 20th century left, they were afraid of two things, two big enemies: chaotic market and strong state power. Well, screw them. China succeeded precisely in combining these two features. So this is for me the big problem, because I think that this is the complexity I want to get. Maybe, as you, Daniel, said, I'm getting old and so on. You know, because for me, the metaphor of the end of communism, Poland, I remember that even 2-3 years before solidarity was legalized, the idea was, but no, communists will stick to power. We will never get free elections. Then, okay, 2-3 years later, they got free elections. But that was for me not the real shock. The real shock was that 4 years later, Jaruzelski was more popular than Valenza. And how was the guy called? I forgot his name. A gay guy who became ex-communist, who became the second after Valenza president of. And usually the racist explanation is, okay, yeah, Poles, stupid, they expected too much from it and so on and so on. No, then they had a stable era, economically very successful, when Donald Tusk was a liberal president. Great progress, standard of living grew, but now they are where they are with Kaczynski. And I am so often reminded of how, although he is the ultimate anti-communist, Kaczynski, he even accused Valenza of being really a communist spy and so on. How many of his measures remind many people of some of the, not in that brutality, bad features of the communist regimes? So, although we are very different, Daniel, my point is precisely how to save this European emancipatory legacy of freedom and so on and so on. So what worries me is this. I even call it the three states.
There's that drinking game where every time Žižek says "and so on" in a debate, you take a shot. And I dread the person who watched this one. I dread what happened to the person who watched this one and played that game.
On the other hand, this authoritarian capitalism, Turkey also, and so on, which unites fundamentalist nationalist ideology with some kind of wild capitalism and so on. That's for me the problem today. And I don't care how you call the solution. Stop.
Thank you, Daniel. The final 5 minutes of this debate belong to you. The floor is yours.
So he will be Comrade Stalin, who says, resumes the meeting.
Comrades, please. Joel, thank you very much. And Slavoj, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this. Slavoj is a very rounded and comprehensive thinker. He writes intelligently about music, about literature. He's fluent.
Even about the films that I
he's
didn't
a real
see. Do you know
pleasure.
that more than half of the movies here?
He's a real pleasure to talk to, if not across. And I've enjoyed the debate immensely. So Slavoj challenged me there to use my 5 minutes to explain China. Well, let me just make 2 points very simply about China. First of all, bouncing back from the utter horror of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, even a fairly rubbish, corrupt socialist country was going to grow impressively, right? When you were going from that nadir of people starving to death because of an autocracy where people were too frightened to tell their superiors the true situation out on the ground, almost any reforms were going to go in the right direction. And to the extent that it became a more market-oriented and property-oriented country, China did better. Nonetheless, I come back to the point I made in my opening remarks. We have some laboratory quality experiments in the world. China, with all of its success, is still lagging way behind the relatively more free market China, in other words, the Republic of China, Taiwan. So we can see that with all, and neither of those is a perfect state, right? We're not dealing in the Platonic world of forms here, but the more market-oriented one is plainly delivering a better standard of living and a more democratic and freer lifestyle for its people than the more socialist one. The ethic of Marxism is not fairness, but force, right? It's very easy to say, I'm a Marxist because I'm compassionate, I'm a nice person, I care about, poor people, minority groups, and so on. If that's all it was, right, who would be against it? I mean, we would all be Marxist if it were that simple. But as Marx himself accepted, and as Slavoj has been honest enough to admit in this debate, that vision of his of a peculiar economic and social outcome could not be allowed to come about democratically. It had to be enforced by the bayonet. He knew that. And it happened everywhere. Because in the end, if you're trying to make people do unnatural things, give up profoundly held beliefs and traditions, lose their attachment to their land, their place, their property, their family, their faith, their flag, in the end, you need to do it through the full power of coercive force. And ultimately, Marxism comes down to the belief that that is justified because there's a better tomorrow, that all of that pain and anguish and bloodshed will be justified by the better tomorrow. And yet, when we look at the economic theories that point the way to this supposed better tomorrow, we find this extraordinary paucity, this poverty of thought, this idea, which is demonstrably false, was already visibly false even in the 19th century when Marx adumbrated the idea that we would run out of resources. First, it was expressed in terms of colonialism, then more recently in terms of environmentalism. It all failed to understand that human ingenuity is not a limited resource, and that as the world becomes richer and more integrated, the people who were previously the poorest see the biggest proportionate uplift in their living standards. And that ultimately is why Marxism is false. And the really extraordinary thing to me is that in 2021, we are debating this at all. That we're still sitting here talking about whether these patently hopeless prophecies and these obviously false solutions had merit. And I come back to saying we can only understand it as some kind of religious cult, some kind of millenarian sect. That yes, it's all been wrong up until now, it's never happened yet, but the promised land is just over the horizon. How ironic, how supremely paradoxical that the miserable old Kantner should have ended up 200 years after his birth, becoming the one thing he would have despised above everything, which is the bearded prophet of a false religion.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers for such a lively and engaging
I will give him
debate.
this. That was a good ending line.
Yeah, I mean, he has some good lines. He's a forceful speaker. Follows the thread of the discussion, and stays on topic. It's just the substance of what he's saying is ridiculous. I mean, he can't. He's pretending that further economic development, lifts the floor, which is true to a point, but it's like also like that somehow addresses like all the reasons to have an issue with economic inequality. He's either abysmally ignorant of what Marx said or being dishonest and conflating it with kind of hippie primitivism, which is the opposite of it at the end there.
Fair, man.
He says that Marx thought that the capitalism was going to run out of resources. I literally don't know what he's talking about. So it's like, given that what he's arguing against, he says, he's denying that Marx is right. Like, what he means by Marx is some vague, weird hodgepodge of all of the non or anti-capitalist thoughts that that exist, even the ones that contradict each other. Then okay, relative to the fact that that's his target, sure, I guess he did okay.
His account of Chinese history is also a tabloid of nonsense, basically. I mean, I don't buy the comparison between China and Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan was a small island. A lot of the most educated and senior personnel in China in the Kuomintang migrated to said island and then benefited from extensive technology transfer and Western support. So it's not really a fair example. But I think, when he talks about China before, first of all, when he says, rebounding from these horrors, well, obviously there were big problems in China, but we always forget this. In the Mao era, average growth was 7.5% a year. I think it was the highest economic growth in any country that had been seen, prior to Deng, right? So it's not like economic growth was low, right? I think only 1 year they regressed during the Great Leap Forward. But I also want to say that later on, when he says, it was inevitable that China would grow, even if they had this sort of shabby bureaucracy, it's like, well, then why is China 6 times more wealthy than India today, right? And I think you really obviously and fundamentally have to conclude that a lot of China's economic success, whatever the failings of the country, have to do with the way that the public sector was used, in a rather assertive way to ensure that there was domestic control over capital and that they weren't just paying out rents to foreign countries. But he can't acknowledge this ideologically because the free market has to be the best and so on, right? So, but I just want to say it's a very, very limited and flawed analysis of Chinese economic history, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was just weird because he's like, well, if Marx has held views that they've never actually held, then we might admire them. But they don't actually hold those views, so we can't do that because they have to kind of implement their position by the barrel of a gun. And look, like you said, like we've all said here before, if you scour the internet enough for some idiosyncratic political position, you'll probably find it, right? So I don't want to say that there are no Marxists out there that kind of fit the profile that he's talking about, because there probably are. But the reality is that Marxism was and always has been most interesting as a critique of political economy, rather than in terms of the prescriptive kind of ideas that Marx very, very rarely will put forward about how we should organize society instead. And I think there are good reasons why he tended to foreground that. I think that he was much more gifted as an analyst than as something like a political theorist who argues for political principles at a relatively abstract level, right? I also think that Marx was convinced, and I think he was probably right about this from a Hegelian standpoint, that you can't create recipes for the cookshops of the future without actually looking at the real world and what's going on in it, because then you just engage in an exercise in theoretical abstraction, right? It's not particularly useful and not particularly helpful. So this characterization of him as kind of a false prophet who is putting forward lofty principles that could never actually be realized and will never be realized, and failed prophecies that didn't tend to materialize. I think that all of that's just completely wrong, and really a caricature of a brilliant analyst who had a lot of interesting things to say about capitalism. Much of it praiseworthy, but also he had a better understanding of the kind of eternal demons that were inherent to the system that will never ever be able to exercise because it was part and parcel of its nature to carry those demons with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yes to all of that. I mean, I also think it's weird. I mean, it's like that he is so focused on the prescriptive stuff, but it's like also, which, as you say, is what Marx spent the least time on. It's like what socialism would be.
I mean,
like.
if you scour all of the collected works of Marx and Engels for prescriptive commentary, right, where Marx says this is what you should do, it would probably all add up, I think, to about 20 pages or so. Little bit of stuff in the Critique of the Gotha Program, a little bit of stuff at the end of the Communist Manifesto. You compare that with the literal thousands of pages dedicated to capital, or even the hundreds of pages just spent caricaturing and ridiculing German idealism. Right? It's not very much at all.
20 pages. I think it's like 3 pages. You have the thing on like the realm.
It's true. It's generous. Generous 20 pages.
Yeah, 20 pages sounded like way too much to me. I was thinking, it was like, wow, are there really 20?
I got to read those other 17 pages.
Exactly.
Someone tell me the angel Gabriel will arrive and tell us the truth.
Yeah, but then also he's got the so he's so focused on that, but then also like Hannan, I don't think has read the 3 pages, because if he had, I mean, I won't repeat everything that we've said in the previous installments about this, but if he'd had, he'd know that that those 3 pages are all about socialism as a radically democratic alternative to capitalism, and there are grounds that you can criticize that vision, but I mean that is what the vision was in those 3 pages, and yet, right, his whole, he wants to primarily criticize Marx by criticizing regimes that have born, for whatever reason we can argue about whether it was historically inevitable or not, but that just did bear very little just resemblance to anything advocated in those 2 or 3 pages, and then he's not even really accurate there, because he's he's undersell, like, look, I mean, what we can broadly call Dengism, the sort of as a broad term for the ideology and practice of post-Maoist China, is got to be one of my all-time least favorite political ideologies. I think it's I think it's awful. It embodies a lot of really bad features of some of its predecessors and competitors. And as Slavoj Žižek has said a few times, I think it would be incredibly depressing for the world, right? If this was the sort of hegemonic alternative, that there was. But also, like, Hannan is not like his critique of it is just dishonest. I think for all the reasons that Conrad said earlier. Like, it's not even if you're gonna like give the good criticisms of it, it would be like, well, it's extremely authoritarian and kind of ethno-nationalist in certain ways, and there's crazy levels of economic inequality and etc. All good criticisms, but like say that it's not really true that like China in this period has grown much faster than any of its competitors is just ridiculous. I mean, just empirically it has, and he's trying to do the usual thing that like libertarians and market conservatives always do when they talk about China's growth, and say that it's well, it's because of the extent to which it resembles laissez-faire capitalism. But I mean, it's silly. I mean, it's like, okay, well, hold on. If that's all because of the extent to which it resembles laissez-faire capitalism, without the public sector being used in this way, and and without the protections against against sort of ravages of outside societies and all that stuff, then why why have all the other places that even more closely resemble the laissez-faire ideal not grown at the rate that that China has? I mean, that they never have a good answer to that. I mean, like it just like clearly the fact is that sort of roughly Dengist combination of market mechanisms and a lot of the standard advantages of markets with having a much higher degree of state control and and a much and just in terms of its strategic role in the development of the economy, much more important public sector. Out of what's been tried so far, that seems to be the winning combo in terms of just like rapid economic development. I mean, I think that I really hope that there's a way to combine some of those features with a much more democratic and egalitarian system that I prefer to live in. But I mean, I think if you're going to have an honest debate about it, I mean, you have to start by acknowledging the success. And Hannan's ideology just won't let him do it.
Well, it's the winning combination for like a third world country within a deeply capitalist international system. And of course, remember that Dengism only became hegemonic at a time in which the Eastern Bloc was already in a state of weakening, right? So I think when you reach a higher level of economic and political development, I think that there are different requirements, right? Like if you want to transition from being like a fairly centralized industrial economy to being a service economy, for example, then you need different forms of education, you need different regulations with respect to speech and all of that. So I'm not so when Žižek says like is the future going to be authoritarian capitalism like China? I think it's possible that there would be like African countries and stuff like that attempt to implement Dengism as a kind of developmental model. Prevent foreign rent extraction. Have a certain role for the marketplace, have a strong central state, and so on. But I think that China, in many ways, they already recognize, in a sense, the limitations of Dengism, and they constantly say that they're like, they always allude to some kind of beyond they have to reach. How fast they'll get to that, I can't say as of now, but I think it's clear that it's not adequate to the kind of system they're aspiring to create, whatever that system may exactly be, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that where you and I disagree is probably the how seriously to take the idea that it's like a goal of the Chinese state to to create something that's that's meaningfully different from that, and the extent to which this is just kind of justified ideology. That like that you say, of course, all this is temporary, but for people who want to see Conrad and I argue about China, you can watch that on the Surfs Times YouTube channel from last year. I think there was like an hour and a half debate. So
also on Capital Comrades YouTube channel, we have the talk. By the way, when I say the Chinese, I don't just mean the government. When I talk about the kind of future they're trying to create, right? I think there's also a lot of working people, right? For example, who are involved in that debate and recognize maybe the limitations of capitalism, but also the unsatisfactory, in many respects, character of their own system, right? So I don't just mean, the Politburo or whatever.
Fair enough. All right, now for something different.
When a local fly fishing guide spotted noted vaccine skeptic Tucker Carlson at a sporting goods store in Livingston, Montana, he did not waste time. You are the worst human being known to mankind. I want you to know that. Dan Bailey can be heard telling the Fox News host in a video posted to his Instagram page Friday night. He captioned the video, "It's not every day you get to tell someone they are the worst person in the world and really mean it." Although the video was filmed inside Dan Bailey's fly shop on Friday, the store is not affiliated with the man who filmed the video, according to a statement on its website. Carlson, in a plaid button-down and a gold watch, can be seen holding his hand up against Bailey's chest, making his trademark exaggerated facial expressions. He appears to grimace, and then, realizing he is being filmed, spreads his mouth into a grin and turns away. Carlson then appears to condescend to the man, calling him son as he walks away.
Do we have the actual video with sound?
Let's take a look and see.
Today, we should say it's a little bit.
What just happened? I don't understand.
What just happened with the video ended?
No, like what was in the video? What was it talking about? I didn't understand. If he was like talking to a guy and you had to watch, I missed it. It was going very fast with this processed voice. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Matt, have you found the video?
Yes.
Drop it into the private chat.
There you go.
All right.
This just brought me a little bit of joy today.
Share screen. Chrome tab.
I want you to this state, to the United States, to everything else in this world. I don't care that you're not school. What you have done to your families, what you have done to everybody else in this system. Son, don't call me son, one.
Tucker Carlson has been made fully aware of where he stands in the eyes of
I think that's the end of it. But I just thought we would all appreciate that.
That's funny.
Fair enough. Yeah. I wonder what the best way to approach that is. If you just see like Tucker Carlson in the wild and you have like 20 seconds to talk to him.
Oh, I think I'd probably respond in exactly that way. My language would be a little bit harsher than the worst person in the world, though. There'd be a lot more swearing, quite a few expletives.
We got to get that guy. You got to get the guy in GTAA, the guy who said that with the hat. I think that'd be a great addition to your.
Yeah,
your
we should. We should find him. I wonder. Yeah, actually, that's a good question. I wonder how to go about like figuring out who the guy is and how to get in touch with him. There's a reminds me of in 2016 during the 2016 election. There was Bill Clinton was at a diner in like Iowa or someplace campaigning for his wife, and there was some there was some dude at the diner who actually like argued with him for like half an hour or something about like welfare reform and neoliberalism and all of that, and Bhaskar actually did manage to like track him down to give him a lifetime subscription to Jacobin for Evan Spence. Having done that for half an hour in there, but yes, if we can find that dude, we will absolutely put him on the show. Meanwhile, we are finally. We are finally done with the Žižek Hannan debate. I should say that we are going to take a week off of the debate breakdowns next Sunday. I have another commitment, but we'll be back the Sunday after it for the main show. On tomorrow, we are doing our Ben Shapiro is wrong about everything episode.
I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
Nathan Robinson, Gene Bajalan, we're going to do a few weeks ago. It had to be rescheduled. So good stuff coming up. Anything you guys want to plug before you go?
I'm just really glad I don't have to be here tomorrow for Nathan Robinson because I'm not the biggest fan. I feel like we'd really get into it about Marxism if he was here. So that's probably good I'm not there.
Fair enough.
I just handed in the Cosmopolitan Socialism How-To Guide. Ben is writing the introduction to that, so I'm very excited about this. And hopefully I'll have some news about a release date soon.
And I was just going to add from August 6th to 9th, I'm doing a conference with Foreign Object. Sepid Imagity from Foreign Object has helped us out a lot. Paul Reynolds from Historical Materialism. But if you go to Foreign Object's website, that's object with a K, you will see we're doing a conference on Marxist epistemology, materialist epistemology, the work of the legacy of the work of Alfred Sohn-Rethel. And there's going to be some great people there like Alberto Toscano, Jason Moore, Mia Gonzalez, and so forth. There were nine speakers. So if you want to learn about, how we can, maybe think of materialist epistemology as opposed to a more idealist one in the vein of Kant, etc., I would encourage you to come and check that out.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, guys.